There is a stretch of desert in northern Egypt where the sand still holds its secrets, where the ground beneath your feet was once shaken by the largest artillery barrage the British Empire had ever launched in a single night, where engineers crawled on hands and knees through the darkness, fingers searching the earth for buried metal, where men from Britain, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India, Germany, and Italy, men who had never chosen to be enemies, stared across the same narrow strip of coastline and understood, in whatever language they thought in, that this was the place where something enormous would be decided. The place was called El Alamein, and in the autumn of 1942, it was the most important piece of ground on earth. Not because it was beautiful. The desert at El Alamein is not the romantic kind. It is flat and pale and punishing. The sun drains color from everything. The wind carries grit into your food, your water, your lungs. There is almost nothing to look at for miles in any direction, just scrub, stone, sand, and the blue line of the Mediterranean to the north. It is, by almost any measure, nowhere, a small coastal railway stop, a name that barely registered on a map before the war. And yet, 80 kilometers to the east lay Alexandria, the great port city of Egypt. Roughly 130 kilometers beyond that lay Cairo, and beyond Cairo, the Suez Canal, the artery through which Britain breathed, the waterway that connected the empire to its eastern territories, to oil, to reinforcements, to survival. Lose El Alamein, and you lose Egypt. Lose Egypt, and you lose the canal. Lose the canal, and you lose something that could not be named on any map, but that every decision-maker in London and Berlin understood with perfect clarity: the war itself, tilting irrevocably in one direction. That is what was sitting on this strip of desert in October of 1942. Not just two armies, not just two commanders, the entire weight of a global conflict, balanced on ground that most of the soldiers fighting over it had never heard of 6 months earlier. Now here is what makes this story extraordinary, and why, if you settle in right now and let this narration carry you through the night, you will not hear a simple tale of British triumph and Axis defeat. You will hear something far more complicated and far more human than that. By the summer of 1942, the British forces in North Africa had been embarrassed. Repeatedly, publicly, painfully, the German general Erwin Rommel, commanding the Afrika Korps, had run circles around British commanders who outranked him in resources and often in numbers. He had chased them across Libya, back into Egypt, and to the very doorstep of Alexandria. He had done it with audacity, with speed, with a gift for finding the gap in a defensive line and driving straight through it before anyone had time to react. The British press had taken to calling him the Desert Fox, and while that nickname was meant to carry a note of grudging respect, it also carried something else: the implication that this was a man the British simply could not catch, could not outthink, could not stop. Rommel was not a myth, but he was becoming one, and that distinction between a capable general and an invincible legend matters enormously in war, because armies fight with their morale as much as their weapons. And then, in August of 1942, a new British general arrived in Egypt. A small, precise, slightly odd man with a fondness for berets and an absolute intolerance for vagueness. His name was Bernard Montgomery. He was not yet famous. He was not yet the figure whose name would become inseparable from this battle and from the eventual Allied victory in Europe. He was simply a general who had been given an army in poor shape and told to fix it, and who responded to that assignment with a kind of calm, almost infuriating certainty that he was going to do exactly that. Montgomery did not speak like most generals. He did not speak in abstractions or in the comfortable fog of military euphemism. He spoke directly, often bluntly, and he made his intentions understood to every level of his command, from division commanders down to individual soldiers. He also had a quality that is rarer than it sounds. He understood that an army's confidence in its own leadership is not a luxury, it is a force multiplier. It is the thing that determines whether men advance when ordered to advance, or whether they hesitate at the critical moment when hesitation costs everything. What follows over the course of this documentary is the full story of how these two men, and the hundreds of thousands of soldiers behind them, arrived at their confrontation in the desert, how the ground was chosen, how the armies were built and supplied and deceived and mined and reorganized, how the night of the 23rd of October 1942 arrived with 900 guns firing simultaneously into the dark, and what happened in the days of brutal, grinding attrition that followed. How a battle that began as a thunderclap became a slow, exhausting siege. How supply lines across the Mediterranean became as decisive as anything that happened on the desert floor. And how, at the end of it, the balance finally broke, and one army retreated, and one army advanced, and North Africa was never the same again. This is not a simple story. Good war documentaries rarely are. The men on both sides were not simple. The decisions made were not simple. The suffering was not simple. We will follow this entire campaign from its origins in the strategic pressures of 1942 through to the pursuit across the Western Desert, and we will try to do justice to the full weight of what happened here, to the engineers crawling through minefields in the dark, to the tank crews navigating by moonlight, to the commanders who faced decisions where every option cost lives. We will tell this story accurately. We will not dress it up in glory that erases what it actually cost. If you are watching this late at night, if you are settling in for a long listen, then this is exactly the kind of story built for that. Long form, layered, unfolding slowly the way the battle itself unfolded, detail by detail, kilometer by kilometer. Let the narration carry you. Let the story breathe. There are 18 chapters ahead of you, and each one adds something to the picture, something you need to understand what comes next. This channel exists to tell these stories in full. Not the headline version, not the 2-minute summary, the entire story, told the way it deserves to be told. If that is what you are here for, subscribe, stay with us. Let this be the kind of night where you fall asleep knowing something real about the world, about what human beings are capable of, at their most organized and most desperate, in the middle of a desert where almost nothing grows. The guns are about to open. The night of the 23rd of October 1942 is coming. And before it does, you need to understand everything that led to it. We begin with North Africa, and a war that had been running for 2 years without resolution, and a narrow corridor of ground between the sea and an impassable depression, a corridor just wide enough for armies to meet, and far too narrow for either side to simply go around the other. El Alamein was not chosen for its beauty. It was chosen because there was nowhere else to go. There is a particular kind of silence that belongs to the desert, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of waiting. The Sahara holds heat the way stone holds memory, slowly, deeply, and without apology. In the summer of 1942, that silence was broken every few hours by the rumble of engines, the crack of artillery, and the low drone of aircraft crossing a sky the color of bleached bone. North Africa had become something no map could quite capture, a corridor of consequence, narrow enough to traverse in days, yet wide enough to swallow armies whole. Along its northern edge ran the Mediterranean Sea, blue and ancient and indifferent to the machinery of modern war. Along its southern edge lay the Katara Depression, a vast geological wound in the Earth's surface dropping more than 100 meters below sea level, its salt flats and soft sand impassable to heavy vehicles, impenetrable to armored columns. Between these two barriers, a strip of coastland and desert became the stage upon which the fate of an entire theatre of war would be decided. It was here, in this hard and sun-baked corridor, that the story of El Alamein begins. To understand why this stretch of North African coast mattered so profoundly, one must think not in terms of towns or roads, but in terms of what lay beyond them. East of the front lines, roughly 100 kilometers of desert separated the fighting from Alexandria, and beyond Alexandria lay Cairo, the administrative heart of British power in the Middle East. Beyond Cairo lay the Suez Canal, arguably the most strategically important waterway on the planet in 1942, linking the Mediterranean to the Red Sea and providing Britain with its fastest route to India, to the oil fields of the Persian Gulf, and to the supply lines that sustained the entire British Commonwealth war effort. If the canal fell, the consequences would ripple outward across every theatre of the war. Britain would face the prospect of rerouting convoys around the southern tip of Africa, adding weeks to every voyage and straining its already overstretched merchant fleet. The mathematics of that loss were staggering, and every British general in the region understood them with cold clarity. But the canal was not the only prize. Further east, beneath the sands of Persia and Iraq, lay oil reserves of extraordinary scale, reserves that powered British and Commonwealth military operations, and which the Axis powers, chronically short of fuel, desperately coveted. There were strategic planners on both sides who understood that a successful Axis drive through Egypt, through the Sinai, and into the oil-producing regions of the Middle East could fundamentally alter the balance of the war. It was not an impossible scenario in the summer of 1942. The Soviet Union was under massive pressure at Stalingrad. The United States was still assembling the industrial and military weight it would eventually bring to bear, and Britain, after years of fighting on too many fronts with too few resources, was stretched thin in ways that its public was not always permitted to know. The Desert War was not a sideshow. It was, in the summer of 1942, one of the most consequential campaigns on Earth. At the center of the Axis effort stood a figure who had, by that point, become something close to a legend. General Erwin Rommel commanded the German Afrika Korps and its attached Italian formations with a style that was aggressive, intuitive, and deeply personal. He led from the front in a way that was almost reckless by the standards of his contemporaries, driving forward to see conditions for himself, making decisions faster than his opponents could respond, and maintaining a psychological dominance over the battlefield that seemed to exceed the material strength of his forces. His campaigns across Libya and into Egypt had been marked by a series of victories that left British commanders bewildered and British soldiers demoralized. He had driven them back across the desert, not once, but repeatedly, capturing Tobruk in late June of 1942 in a single day's fighting that shocked Churchill personally and shook British confidence to its foundations. By the time midsummer arrived, Rommel and his forces had pushed to within roughly 100 kilometers of Alexandria, close enough that the British naval base began evacuating documents and the Egyptian capital showed the first signs of panic. The British position in Egypt in the early months of 1942 was marked by a corrosive mixture of exhaustion, uncertainty, and institutional dysfunction. The Eighth Army, the formation responsible for holding the line, had fought across thousands of kilometers of desert in conditions that ground men and machines down with equal thoroughness. Leadership had cycled through a succession of commanders, each one inheriting the problems of his predecessor, along with new ones of his own making. Tactical doctrine was inconsistent. Armor and infantry rarely cooperated effectively. Supply arrangements were often improvised rather than systematic. There was courage in abundance. The men who fought in the desert were not lacking in personal valor. But courage alone cannot substitute for coordination, and coordination was precisely what the Eighth Army had struggled to achieve. The desert had a way of exposing every organizational weakness with brutal, unhurried thoroughness. General Claude Auchinleck, the commander-in-chief in the Middle East, had made the decision that would prove to be strategically sound, even as it failed to bring him personal glory. When Rommel's momentum threatened to carry the Afrika Korps all the way to Cairo, Auchinleck identified a position that could not be outflanked. The small coastal settlement of El Alamein had, in itself, almost nothing to recommend it. A railway halt, a scattering of buildings, no strategic significance of its own, but its geography was everything. Here, for the first time, the narrow corridor between the Mediterranean and the impassable Qattara Depression compressed to a width of roughly 60 kilometers. There was no room to swing around a flank. There was no opportunity for the kind of sweeping, encircling maneuver that had defined Rommel's earlier victories. An army defending El Alamein could not be bypassed. It could only be attacked frontally, which meant that for the first time, the defenders held a structural advantage that offset much of the attacker's operational genius. Auchinleck ordered his forces to hold this line, and hold it they did, at significant cost, through desperate fighting in late June and into July, in what became known as the First Battle of El Alamein. The stabilization of the front at El Alamein was a genuine achievement, but it arrived too late to save Auchinleck's position. London was deeply dissatisfied with the pace and nature of British performance in North Africa, and Churchill, impatient by temperament, under political pressure at home, and acutely aware of how much depended on reversing the direction of the Desert War, decided that new leadership was required. The decision was not made lightly, and the men around Churchill debated it at length. Auchinleck had, in a meaningful sense, done the most important thing. He had stopped Rommel. But stopping was not enough. What London needed, and what the Eighth Army needed, was a commander who could not merely hold the line but break through it, who could transform a battered, uncertain force into an instrument capable of decisive offensive action. That commander, it was decided, would be General Bernard Law Montgomery. The choice of Montgomery was not universally welcomed. He was known as a difficult personality, demanding, self-certain to the point of arrogance, not always kind to colleagues or superiors who questioned his methods. He had a talent for making enemies, and he exercised it frequently. But he also had something that the Eighth Army desperately needed: clarity. Montgomery's approach to command was built on the conviction that soldiers fight best when they know exactly what is expected of them, when their supply arrangements are reliable, when their commanders inspire confidence, and when the plan is clear enough to survive the confusion of battle. These were not revolutionary ideas, but they were ideas that had been inconsistently applied in the desert, and Montgomery applied them with a consistency that bordered on obsession. When he received word of his appointment in August of 1942, he moved immediately, not gradually, not cautiously, but with the kind of purposeful energy that signals genuine conviction. His arrival in Egypt was itself a statement. Montgomery flew into the theatre and assumed command before his formal orders had fully processed through the chain of authority, a breach of protocol that he made without apparent concern, because waiting, in his assessment, was a form of waste he could not afford. He went immediately to the front, speaking to officers and men, assessing conditions, formulating impressions. What he found was an army that had been told too many times to prepare to retreat, an army whose contingency planning was oriented as much toward withdrawal as toward attack. Montgomery abolished those plans. He issued orders making clear that the Eighth Army would not retreat from El Alamein under any circumstances, that they would fight where they stood or die where they stood, and that this was not a temporary posture, but a permanent one. It was a dramatic gesture, but drama, carefully calibrated, can accomplish things that memoranda cannot. The psychological effect of this clarity should not be underestimated. Morale in an army is not a simple variable. It rises and falls in response to dozens of inputs simultaneously. But one of its most powerful drivers is the sense that those in command know what they are doing and mean what they say. Montgomery radiated both qualities with an intensity that his subordinates found, at first, almost disconcerting. He was confident in ways that seemed unjustified by the circumstances, and yet that confidence proved contagious. Gradually, then more rapidly, the tone of the Eighth Army began to shift. The anxious, defensive crouch of an army accustomed to retreat began, slowly, to loosen. Something new was taking shape in the desert, not yet visible in the casualty figures or the position of the front lines, but present in the way men talked about the future and in the way they described their commander. That shift, subtle and imprecise as it was, represented the first movement of a very large and significant change. The desert was still waiting. The silence had not yet broken, but the quality of that waiting had changed, and that change, invisible on any map, would come to matter enormously in the weeks ahead. The desert had a way of consuming men, not just their bodies, but their certainty, the quiet confidence that a soldier carries into a campaign like a canteen, full at the start, draining with every mile. By the summer of 1942, the British Eighth Army had been drinking from that canteen for a long time. They had pushed forward and been pushed back. They had celebrated gains that dissolved within weeks. They had watched commanders rotate through headquarters tents with the regularity of tides, each one arriving with promises, each one departing with excuses. The men in the sand had developed a particular kind of exhaustion, not merely physical, but something deeper, a weariness of being led without being believed in. Into this atmosphere, in the first days of August 1942, a single aircraft descended toward Egypt, carrying a man who would, within weeks, alter the entire psychological architecture of that army. General Bernard Law Montgomery stepped onto Egyptian soil with the bearing of a man who had already decided how the story would end. He was lean, precise, and utterly without the social graces that some commanders used as lubricant between rank and responsibility. He did not perform warmth, he performed clarity. Montgomery had spent decades studying the science of command, not just the movement of units on maps, but the human machinery underneath those movements, the way fear and confusion could collapse an advance just as surely as enemy fire. He arrived not as a man discovering his circumstances, but as a man who had already catalogued them, weighed them, and begun constructing his response. The Eighth Army was in poor shape, he knew it, and unlike some who had known it before him, he had no intention of pretending otherwise. His first acts were not grand gestures, they were surgical. Montgomery moved immediately to visit units across the front, not for ceremony, but for diagnosis. He wanted to look into the faces of the men who would have to fight, to understand what had been broken in them and what remained sound. What he found confirmed what the reports had suggested. A force that was capable, that contained genuine fighting quality in its infantry, its gunners, and its engineers, but that had been systematically undermined by inconsistent command, muddled objectives, and the creeping belief that the enemy was simply better. That last problem troubled him most. Armies that believe themselves inferior to the opposition tend to confirm the belief. Montgomery set about dismantling that psychology from the first day. He began with the command structure itself, because he understood that confusion at the top filtered downward like water through cracked stone. The Eighth Army had operated, in certain critical periods, with a diffusion of authority that left subordinate commanders uncertain who held the final word. Orders sometimes contradicted one another. Planning horizons were short. Montgomery imposed a hierarchy that was unambiguous and unconditional. He would command, his corps commanders would execute, and the chain would hold at every link. He relieved officers he considered unsuited to the demands ahead, not from cruelty, but from conviction that the wrong man in the wrong position was a form of sabotage, however unintentional. The reorganization was uncomfortable. It was also necessary, and Montgomery was entirely at peace with necessary discomfort. Supply was the second target of his attention, and here his thinking was almost engineering in its precision. The Eighth Army had suffered repeatedly from a gap between what was promised to forward units and what actually arrived. Ammunition, fuel, food, replacement parts. The mechanics of modern warfare demanded a continuous and reliable flow, and that flow had been interrupted too often by poor organization and inadequate prioritization. Montgomery worked with his quartermaster staff to establish clearer supply routes, more realistic accounting of what formations required to sustain offensive operations, and a firm insistence that logistics be treated not as an administrative afterthought, but as a combat function equal in importance to any other. He was not interested in bold attacks that exhausted themselves 20 kilometers from the start line. He wanted operations that could be sustained. The question of morale, which he had been turning over since before he landed, required a different kind of intervention, one less mechanical and more personal. Montgomery began speaking directly to his soldiers, not through layers of staff officers or through communiques read aloud at morning parade, but face to face. He would stand in front of groups of men, tankers, riflemen, signalers, without notes, without ceremony, and speak to them plainly about what was expected and what was coming. He told them the Eighth Army would not retreat again. He told them this without decoration, as a statement of fact rather than a rallying cry. Whether those men fully believed him in those first August days is uncertain, but they heard something in his manner that they had not heard from the desert in a long time. Conviction that was not performing itself. Conviction that appeared entirely structural, built into the man rather than projected for effect. The defensive posture he ordered was itself a message. Previous British strategy in North Africa had been shaped, in part, by an anxiety that stillness was weakness, that failing to advance was failing entirely. This had driven costly attacks at moments when consolidation would have served better, and it had left formations spread thin across ground they could not adequately hold. Montgomery reversed this logic entirely. The Eighth Army would dig in, it would fortify, it would prepare, methodically and without apology, until the moment of its choosing. This was not timidity. It was the deliberate accumulation of advantage before the moment of decisive action, a calculation that Montgomery trusted completely, even when external pressure urged faster movement. Among those pressures was Prime Minister Winston Churchill, whose appetite for offensive results was both constant and vocally expressed. Churchill had crossed the Mediterranean to Egypt himself in early August, dissatisfied with what he found, and determined to impose new energy on the command. The resulting personnel changes had brought Montgomery to his position, but Churchill's demands for early action were not something the new general was prepared to simply absorb. Montgomery had assessed the timeline required to rebuild, re-equip, and retrain the Eighth Army, and that timeline was not subject to revision by political enthusiasm. He communicated this position, firmly, without visible anxiety, and proceeded on his own schedule. It was a form of professional courage that not every general possessed, the willingness to stand between an impatient government and an unready army and absorb the pressure rather than pass it downward. Training occupied a significant part of the September weeks that followed, and Montgomery's approach to it reflected the same methodology he applied to everything else. He wanted his soldiers to practice not just individual skills but combined operations, the coordination of infantry, armor, and artillery that had failed too often in the field because formations had not rehearsed it sufficiently beforehand. He established training programs that simulated the conditions his men would actually encounter, and he insisted on standards rather than completion. An exercise finished badly was less valuable than an exercise repeated until the coordination was real. The army that would fight at El Alamein was being constructed in those dry rehearsal weeks, with the same attention that an engineer gives to a bridge he intends to cross under weight. The tank situation received particular scrutiny. British armour had underperformed against German anti-tank guns repeatedly, partly because of equipment limitations, and partly because of tactical habits that exposed tanks to fire they could not effectively return. New vehicles were arriving, American-built machines that offered improved performance, and Montgomery worked to ensure that the crews receiving them also received the doctrine to use them effectively. He was resistant to the idea of massed armor charges, unsupported by infantry and artillery, a practice that had produced dramatic losses for marginal gains. The integration of arms that he demanded in training was meant to produce a different kind of armored action, slower in its inception, more deliberate, but far more likely to achieve and hold its objectives. Across the front, the men of the Eighth Army began to notice something they could not immediately name. The quality of information reaching them improved. They were told more about what was expected and why. The rotation of commanders slowed. The chaos that had preceded Montgomery's arrival gave way to a quieter, more purposeful tempo. None of this felt revolutionary from inside it. Revolutions rarely do. But the cumulative effect of clearer orders, better organized supply, and a general who appeared genuinely certain of eventual victory created a different atmosphere in the desert. Not euphoria, not recklessness, something more durable than either. A working confidence, the kind that does not require constant renewal because it is grounded in preparation rather than hope. By the end of August 1942, Bernard Montgomery had been in Egypt for less than a month. In that time, he had reorganized command, stabilized supply, begun retraining his army, and held the line against pressure to move before the army was ready. He had not yet fired a major offensive shot. The battle that would define his reputation, and the battle that would define the fate of North Africa, still lay weeks away across the minefields and the sand. But the Eighth Army that would fight that battle was already, in the quiet and deliberate weeks of preparation, becoming something it had not been before. It was becoming an army that believed, with reasonable and considered grounds, that it was capable of winning. In the mathematics of warfare, that transformation was worth more than most calculations allowed. Erwin Rommel was not a man who waited comfortably. His entire reputation, built across the battlefields of France and forged white-hot in the crucible of the Western Desert, rested on speed, on striking before the enemy could organize, on turning the opponent's confusion into his own advantage. By late August of 1942, he understood with the clarity of a soldier who had read the map 1,000 times that his window was closing. Montgomery had arrived. The British were receiving men and machines in quantities that Rommel could not hope to match. Every week that passed tipped the balance further against him, and Rommel, more than almost any other commander of his era, grasped what that arithmetic meant. If he was going to break the British line at El Alamein, he had to do it now, before that imbalance became irreversible. And so he ordered his forces forward, gambling the last meaningful reserves of German and Italian offensive strength on one final lunge eastward toward the Nile. The plan that Rommel set in motion bore the name Operation Ida, and it carried with it the ambitions of an entire campaign. The concept was characteristically bold, characteristic of the man who had named himself into legend by doing precisely what his enemies assumed was impossible. Axis armoured formations would swing south, pass beneath the British defensive line near the Katara Depression, and then pivot northward and eastward to strike the Eighth Army from behind, cutting off its supply routes, collapsing the position at El Alamein, and opening the road to Alexandria. It was the kind of sweeping maneuver that had worked before, in France, in the earlier desert campaigns, where speed and shock had compensated for numerical inferiority. If it succeeded here, the war in North Africa was effectively over. If it failed, Rommel knew with the instincts of a veteran commander that there would be no second attempt. The assault began in the small hours of the last days of August, when armoured columns rolled southward through the desert dark. Almost immediately, the night turned against them. The southern approaches that German intelligence had characterized as lightly mined proved to be something else entirely, a dense, carefully prepared field of anti-tank and anti-personnel mines that had been laid by British engineers who had anticipated precisely this route. Men and machines began to slow. Sappers moved forward to clear lanes while artillery opened from positions that should, by Rommel's calculations, have been too far away to respond so quickly. The British had not simply been sitting behind their lines cooking meals and waiting to be flanked. They had been watching, preparing, and thinking. The opening hours of Operation Ida cost the Axis forces far more time and far more men than the plan had allowed for. Time mattered enormously, because everything Rommel needed, fuel, ammunition, food, water, was already running desperately short. The supply situation that had dogged the Afrika Korps for months had not improved. If anything, it had deteriorated. British naval forces and aircraft operating from Malta had been attacking Axis supply convoys crossing the Mediterranean with brutal effectiveness, and the quantities of fuel reaching Rommel's army bore almost no resemblance to the quantities that had been promised. Rommel had launched Operation Ada, with reserves of fuel that he knew were inadequate, operating on the assumption that once the breakthrough occurred, captured British supplies would sustain the advance. It was a gamble embedded within a gamble, a plan that could only work if its first stage succeeded quickly, cleanly, and completely. The delays in the minefield shredded that assumption before dawn had broken over the desert. As the hours passed and the Axis armoured columns ground slowly through the minefield belts, the Royal Air Force arrived in force. Aircraft swept in from the east and north, attacking in waves that continued through the day and into the following night. The strikes were not random harassment. They were coordinated, persistent, and aimed with the intelligence of a force that knew where the enemy was and where he was trying to go. Vehicles burned, columns halted, dispersed, and then tried to reform. The commanders on the ground reported back to Rommel what he was already beginning to understand. The timetable had collapsed. The quick, clean sweep around the British flank had become something slower, more painful, more exposed. By the time the leading Axis elements had cleared the worst of the minefields and attempted to pivot northward, they were hours behind schedule, miles short of their intended positions, and already consuming fuel at a rate that left no margin for error. General Georg Stumme, who was in effective command of Axis forces at that moment, with Rommel still technically away on sick leave before returning to the battle personally, faced decisions of mounting urgency. The men pushing northward now encountered not the rear areas of a surprised and disorganized British army, but prepared defensive positions on the Alam Halfa Ridge, a long, low elevation that dominated the approaches from the south and west. Montgomery had identified this ground weeks earlier as the critical terrain feature, the place where any southern flanking movement would have to pass or be stopped entirely. He had positioned his strongest armoured formations there, dug in and waiting, covered by artillery and anti-tank guns, with instructions to let the Axis armour come to them rather than chasing out into open ground where Rommel's talent for mobile combat gave him an advantage. It was a fundamentally different kind of British thinking, patient, prepared, and fully comfortable with surrendering the illusion of dramatic action in favour of the grinding reality of positional strength. When the Axis armour struck at Alam Halfa, it hit something that refused to break. German and Italian tank crews who had grown accustomed to British armoured units advancing to engage them, found instead a wall of steel and fire that did not move, did not retreat, and did not offer the kind of flanks that could be turned. British tanks fired from hull-down positions, presenting minimal profiles while their guns reached out across the flat desert approaches. Anti-tank screens added depth to the defence. Artillery, which Montgomery had been reorganising and rearming since his arrival, brought down coordinated fire on Axis formations that were now moving in daylight, in the open, under a sky that the Royal Air Force had never surrendered. The attackers could not get around the ridge to the north. They could not break through it frontally, and every hour they sat before it, the fuel gauges dropped further. Rommel himself had returned to the battle as the fighting at Alam Halfa intensified, driven back to the desert from Europe by the urgency of the situation. What he found when he arrived did not encourage him. He could see the shape of the failure taking form in real time, could read in the fuel consumption reports and the casualty returns and the distance measurements on his operational maps, the story of a plan that had run out of room and run out of luck simultaneously. The mobile battle he had designed to exploit British confusion had never materialized, because British confusion had never materialized. Montgomery had robbed him of the essential ingredient that made every previous Rommel victory possible: surprise and disorder in the enemy camp. The British, for once, had known what was coming and had prepared something adequate to meet it. The decision to withdraw came with a weight that Rommel would have carried differently even 6 months earlier. In the earlier days of the North African campaign, a setback could be absorbed, regrouped around, and answered with a fresh manoeuvre that caught the British off balance before they could consolidate. But those days had passed. The forces he was withdrawing now were not temporarily checked forces that would recover their strength and strike again. They were depleted formations, pulling back from ground they had paid in blood and fuel to reach, returning to defensive positions without the resources to mount another major offensive in any foreseeable time frame. The men who made that return journey through the minefield lanes, again, back the way they had come, were not defeated soldiers in the theatrical sense, but they were something arguably more sobering, an army that had thrown its best available punch and found that it was not enough. British and Commonwealth forces, following Montgomery's explicit orders, did not pursue aggressively as the Axis formations withdrew. This restraint frustrated some commanders, who felt that a vigorous chase might have destroyed more of the retreating enemy. But Montgomery had a logic that was as cold as it was clear. His army was not yet ready for the kind of mobile pursuit that would be needed to annihilate a withdrawing force in open desert. The preparations he was making were aimed at a different battle, a larger and more conclusive engagement that would come when every element of his plan was in place, not before. He was unwilling to risk the damage of premature action against the certainty of deliberate, prepared assault. It was the governing principle of everything he was building, and he held to it, even when holding to it meant watching the Axis army limp westward to temporary safety. What settled into the desert after Operation Aida failed was a kind of stillness that both sides understood differently. For the Axis forces, now returned to their defensive positions, it was the stillness of exhaustion and diminishing options, the quiet of an army that has spent what it could not afford and must now wait to see what the payment demands. Rommel began giving more attention to defensive planning, to the depth and structure of the minefield belts on his side of the line, to the question of how long his forces could hold against the offensive that he knew was being prepared against him. The initiative, that irreplaceable, invisible quality that had defined his campaigning from the moment he stepped onto African soil, had passed out of his hands. For the British, the stillness was different, purposeful, organized, accelerating. Every dawn brought more men, more tanks, more shells. Every week of quiet was a week that narrowed the gap between what Montgomery intended and what he currently possessed. The desert held its breath in the September heat, and both sides knew that when the silence finally broke, it would break on someone else's terms. The desert does not forgive hesitation. It does not reward armies that pause too long, think too slowly, or lead by committee. Through the long weeks of September 1942, Bernard Montgomery understood this with a clarity that bordered on obsession. He had inherited an army that had been retreating, regrouping, and retreating again for the better part of 2 years. An army that had developed an almost institutional relationship with withdrawal, where the instinct to fall back had become reflexive, encoded into the muscle memory of its officers and men. That inheritance was now his problem to correct. And correction, in Montgomery's world, began not with speeches or morale-boosting theatre, but with structure, with system, with the deliberate, patient reconstruction of an organization from its foundations upward. His first act as commander had been to forbid any further planning for retreat. His second was to begin dismantling the command arrangements that had allowed previous defeats to happen. The Eighth Army had been led by a culture of improvisation, fast, flexible, decentralized, that had once seemed like a strength, but had revealed itself to be a critical vulnerability. Individual brigade commanders had operated with wide discretionary authority, which in theory allowed rapid response to Rommel's fast-moving panzer tactics, but in practice had produced fragmented efforts, poor coordination, and wasted firepower. Montgomery looked at this arrangement and saw not flexibility but fragmentation. He began drawing the lines of authority tighter, insisting that formations fight as cohesive divisions rather than scattered brigade groups. The era of the independent battle group, born of necessity, hardened by defeat, was over. Reorganizing an army in the field is not a neat exercise. It is disruptive by nature, and September 1942 was often uncomfortable for the officers who found themselves either elevated or quietly sidelined as Montgomery shaped his command in his own image. Those who shared his vision of concentrated firepower and methodical preparation found themselves given responsibilities. Those who favored the looser, more improvisational approach that had characterized earlier campaigns found themselves reassigned, retired, or simply moved to quieter roles. Montgomery was not sentimental about this process, and made no effort to appear so. His manner in command was direct to the edge of abrasiveness, certain of his own judgment, resistant to challenge, and entirely indifferent to whether his generals liked him. What he required was not affection but compliance with a single, coherent plan. That plan began with the artillery. In the doctrinal revision Montgomery brought to the desert, artillery was not a supporting arm that followed the infantry. It was the dominant weapon around which all other action was organized. He centralized control of his artillery at corps and army level, giving senior commanders the ability to mass fire from dozens of batteries simultaneously against a single target, rather than parceling guns out to individual divisions where they would be used piecemeal. This was not a new idea in the history of warfare, but it was new to how the Eighth Army had been fighting, and the implications were considerable. It meant that when the offensive eventually came, the weight of metal falling on Axis positions would be concentrated, overwhelming, and sustained, not scattered taps across a wide front, but a single, crushing fist. Supply was the second great reform. Rommel had often outmaneuvered British forces, not because he had more men or better equipment, but because he moved faster and used what he had more efficiently. British logistics through the preceding campaigns had been cumbersome, with supply chains that were frequently disrupted, tank fuel stocks poorly distributed, and ammunition dumps located in positions that made rapid drawdown difficult during fluid operations. Montgomery's staff worked through September to rationalize these arrangements, establishing clear lines of resupply, pre-positioning stocks at forward depots, and implementing the kind of rigorous accounting systems that ensured commanders at every level knew exactly what they had, where it was, and how long it would last. Unglamorous work, entirely invisible to the soldiers who would eventually benefit from it, but as important as any tactical decision made before the battle began. And the equipment was arriving. Through the weeks of September, convoys docking at Alexandria and Suez were unloading crates, stenciled with origins from Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India, and the United States. New medium tanks rolled off transport ships, more capable machines than the ones that had been knocked out in the engagements of the preceding months, and began making their way forward to the armored regiments waiting in the desert. Alongside them came improved anti-tank guns with greater range and penetrating power, artillery pieces with higher rates of fire, and the accumulated material of a global industrial effort that Axis supply officers could only observe with quiet despair. The quantities were not dramatic by the standards of the great battles being fought on the Eastern Front, but in the narrow context of North Africa, they represented a decisive shift in the balance of hardware. Training consumed September as thoroughly as organization and logistics. Montgomery had made an assessment of his infantry and armor that was honest to the point of harshness. Many units were technically competent, but had never operated together in the integrated fashion he demanded. Tanks and infantry had learned, the hard way, to be wary of each other. Armored crews who felt unsupported by foot soldiers, infantry who had watched tanks surge ahead and leave them exposed. Cooperation between arms had broken down repeatedly in earlier fighting, and the resulting mistrust had made each component weaker than it needed to be. The response was a training program that placed infantry and armor in joint exercises, working through the problems of minefield passage, fire support, and communication that would dominate the coming battle. Day after day, in the scrub behind the El Alamein line, regiments rehearsed the mechanics of attack until the procedures became automatic. The psychological dimension of this preparation was as significant as the tactical. An army's willingness to advance under fire is not solely a matter of individual courage. It is shaped by trust in leadership, confidence in equipment, and a shared belief that the plan is sound and the preparation thorough. The Eighth Army in the late summer of 1942 had its courage in abundance, but the trust and confidence had been eroded by too many retreats, too many plans that had failed, too many promised armored reinforcements that had arrived too late or been squandered. Montgomery addressed this not through inspirational rhetoric alone, but through the more persuasive language of visible preparation. When soldiers saw the ammunition dumps growing, the new tanks arriving, the methodical briefings being conducted, the careful rehearsals being run, they began, cautiously, to believe that this time the preparation was genuine. That belief, once kindled, began to replace the defensive reflex with something more aggressive. Montgomery himself was the visible embodiment of this shift, and he understood the importance of being seen. He traveled extensively through the army's positions during September, meeting units in the field, talking to officers and soldiers, with an informality that contrasted sharply with his reputation for rigid authority. He wore his distinctive double-badged beret with an unself-conscious eccentricity that men found memorable. He spoke plainly, without the hedging language of a commander managing expectations. He said the attack would come, that it would succeed, and that he had organized everything to ensure that it would. Whether or not every man who heard him fully believed it, the confidence he projected was itself a kind of supply, distributed through the army in place of doubt. Commonwealth formations contributed their own distinct cultures to this rebuilding. Australian divisions, New Zealand brigades, South African and Indian units, each brought traditions of tactical independence and fighting ability that Montgomery was careful not to crush in his drive for centralized command. The challenge was integration without homogenization, absorbing these formations into a coherent army structure, while preserving the particular qualities of initiative and stubbornness that made them formidable. It was a command balance that required sensitivity Montgomery did not always display naturally, but which his staff officers managed with considerable skill in the daily work of organization and allocation. By the final days of September, the transformation was not complete. It never could be, in the time available, but it was far enough advanced to be recognizable as something qualitatively different from what had existed a month before. The Eighth Army had not yet fought its battle. Its mettle was untested under the specific conditions that Montgomery's preparations were designed to create. But the characteristics of a defeated army, the defensive crouch, the improvised arrangements, the quiet assumption that the next retreat was already being planned, were fading. In their place was the particular atmosphere of an organization that has been told and has begun to believe that it knows exactly what it is going to do. Across the desert positions, from the Mediterranean coast to the edge of the impassable Qattara Depression, the waiting continued. But it was a different kind of waiting now, not the anxious stillness of an army expecting to be hit, but the controlled tension of one preparing to strike. The desert between the sea and the depression is not empty. It never was. But in the weeks following Montgomery's arrival, it begins to fill with something new. Not men marching, not tanks grinding forward, not the familiar restless momentum of North African warfare. It fills with silence and patience and the deliberate, methodical labor of men burying death in the sand. The narrow corridor running from the Mediterranean coast southward to the vast, impassable salt flat known as the Qattara Depression stretches barely 60 kilometers from end to end. It is one of the strangest geographical constraints of the entire war, a natural bottleneck that strips away the Axis advantage of open flank maneuver and forces both armies into a face-to-face contest they cannot easily escape. Montgomery understands this. Rommel understands this. And so, in the long, grinding weeks of September 1942, the ground between them becomes a kind of terrible architecture. The British engineering effort is staggering in its scale and its secrecy. Working largely under the cover of darkness to avoid observation by Axis reconnaissance aircraft, teams of sappers and Royal Engineer units begin the painstaking work of constructing a defensive minefield system unlike anything previously assembled in the Western Desert. Each mine must be laid with care, buried at the correct depth, armed correctly, its position recorded with precision so that British forces themselves do not stumble into their own defences. The work is dangerous, beyond what the term suggests. A momentary lapse of attention, a slight miscalculation of pressure, a detonator just sensitive enough, and a man is gone. Medics would note that the injuries from mine accidents during the laying phase were as grievous as any sustained in direct combat. Yet the work continues, night after night, the figures of engineers moving quietly through the moonlit desert with the methodical calm of men who have decided that fear, if not conquered, must at least be deferred. By the time the effort reaches its full extent, nearly 500,000 mines have been laid across the El Alamein line. The number requires a moment of consideration. 500,000 individual steel and metal casings, each one waiting in the sand. The minefield system is not a single belt but a complex layered network, fields of anti-tank mines designed to stop armor, interspersed with anti-personnel mines designed to kill and maim the infantry that might otherwise clear a path. Between these fields run corridors and dummy passages intended to funnel attackers into pre-registered kill zones covered by artillery and machine gun positions. The geometry of it is cold and deliberate, an equation not of movement but of denial. The British were building not a front line but a maze, and the Axis forces would eventually have to walk into it. The engineers who accomplished this did not belong to the popular imagination of the warrior. They were not cavalrymen or tank commanders. They were craftsmen of a particular kind, men with wire and probes and measuring tapes, men who read the ground the way a cartographer reads a map. Many came from the Commonwealth nations that had sent their young men across oceans to fight in a war fought on someone else's sand. Australian, South African, New Zealand, Indian, units from across the British imperial world knelt in the dark alongside men from Scotland and Lancashire and Kent, all of them performing the same patient, anonymous, dangerous work. History would rarely speak their names, but the battle that came would be shaped entirely by what their hands had buried. On the other side of the line, the Axis forces were constructing their own version of this buried world. German and Italian engineers laid their own extensive minefields across the forward zones, creating what would later be described by British officers as the most formidable defensive minefield system they had encountered. The Germans applied characteristic thoroughness, marking fields with precision, integrating them with wire obstacles and defensive positions, ensuring that any attacker would face not just the mines themselves, but coordinated fire from positions registered to exploit exactly the kind of confusion that a minefield creates. The Italians, often dismissed in Allied accounts with a condescension that history would partially correct, constructed substantial fortified positions and contributed significantly to the overall defensive network. Whatever the popular caricature suggested, the men who built and occupied those Italian positions were soldiers doing their work in difficult conditions with diminishing supplies and no illusions about the battle that was coming. The space between the two mine systems, the no-man's land that separated British and Axis positions, became one of the most contested and dangerous stretches of ground in the Western Desert Campaign. Patrols moved through it nightly. Both sides sent out raiding parties, reconnaissance teams, and fighting patrols to probe enemy positions, identify mine boundaries, and take prisoners who might reveal information about dispositions and intentions. The darkness was full of movement and menace. A patrol stepping wrongly, misjudging a boundary, following a false path. The consequences were immediate and final. Yet the patrols continued, because both sides needed information, and information could only be gathered by men willing to walk through ground that might kill them with every step. The geography that made this all possible, or rather, that made it necessary, deserves its own consideration. The Katara Depression is not merely a geographic obstacle in the bureaucratic military sense of the phrase. It is a place of genuine strangeness, a vast basin lying below sea level, its floor a mixture of salt marsh and soft sand that would swallow any armored vehicle that attempted to cross it. The depression drops sharply enough and extends far enough to render a true flanking maneuver effectively impossible for the forces of 1942. This was the geological fact that turned El Alamein into a siege rather than a battle of maneuver. Rommel, whose genius had been constructed on exactly such maneuver, the swift turning movement, the unexpected thrust through an open flank, was now being handed a position where his greatest skill had nowhere to operate. The sand and salt of the Katara had done more to constrain him than any British general had managed in 2 years of fighting. Montgomery grasped this reality with both hands. His defensive preparations were not those of a general waiting to be hit and hoping to survive. They were the preparations of a general who intended to absorb the last Axis offensive, grind it down against his prepared positions, and then launch a counter-offensive on ground and terms of his own choosing. The minefields were not merely defensive, they were part of an offensive design, a means of shaping the coming battle before a single British infantry platoon crossed a start line. Every mine was a vote for a particular kind of battle, methodical, material, grinding, attritional. A battle that suited an army with superior numbers, superior supply, and superior air power. A battle that Rommel, whatever his brilliance, was poorly equipped to win. The psychological weight of the minefield landscape extended beyond the engineers who laid it, and the soldiers who would eventually fight through it. For the men of both armies living along the line through September and into October, the knowledge of what lay beneath the ground around them worked on the mind in particular ways. Movement became deliberate. Ground that looked identical from 1 meter to the next could carry entirely different meanings: safe passage or buried death. Veterans spoke later of a heightened attention to the earth itself, a strange intimacy with the ground they walked, a consciousness of surface and depth that persisted long after the war ended. The minefield was not just a tactical obstacle, it was a psychological condition, a shared understanding between enemies that the ground between them had been transformed into something hostile to human life, in a way that transcended even the fighting itself. Logistics bound everything together in ways that the popular story of desert warfare often neglects. Moving nearly 500,000 mines from supply points to laying positions required a chain of trucks, drivers, supply officers, and administrative staff whose work was as essential as the engineers who laid them. Each mine had to be transported without detonating it, stored correctly, issued to the right unit at the right time. The administrative apparatus underpinning the entire minefield construction effort was itself a feat of organization, one that reflected Montgomery's insistence on clear, functioning supply chains as the foundation of everything else. He had told his senior officers that an army that did not know where its next meal was coming from could not be expected to think clearly about its next battle. The minefields were proof that the Eighth Army was, for the first time in some months, thinking with clarity. As October approached and the preparations continued, the El Alamein line began to take on its final form. From the air, and both sides flew reconnaissance missions constantly, it would have appeared as two distinct belts of fortification facing each other across a narrow strip of contested ground, each one a maze of earthworks, wire, and buried ordnance. On the maps of staff officers on both sides, it looked abstract, lines and symbols and estimated positions. On the ground, among the men who had built it, and who now lived behind it, it was something else entirely. It was a physical fact, a reality laid into the earth with hands and tools and time. When the guns finally opened on the night of the 23rd of October, everything that had been quietly built in the weeks before would determine whether an army advanced or died in the attempt. The mines did not care which side had laid them. The character of the coming battle had already been written into the ground before a single shot was fired in anger. Two armies had spent weeks transforming a narrow strip of North African desert into the most heavily mined stretch of territory in the history of the war to that point. The engineers who built it had done their work in darkness and in danger, without fanfare, with the quiet professionalism of men who understood that the battle was not something that happened suddenly, but something that was made, carefully and deliberately, over time. What lay beneath the sand at El Alamein in October 1942 was not simply explosive ordnance. It was intention. It was strategy made physical. It was, in the most literal sense possible, the shape of things to come. War has always rewarded the commander who knows more than his enemy. Not simply more troops, more guns, or more fuel, but more truth. In the autumn of 1942, as Bernard Montgomery prepared the Eighth Army for the most consequential battle of the North African campaign, the British possessed a weapon so extraordinary, so carefully guarded, that most of the men who would fight and die at El Alamein never knew it existed. Buried in a Victorian estate in the English countryside, in a collection of prefabricated wooden huts staffed by mathematicians, linguists, and crossword enthusiasts, the government code and cipher school at Bletchley Park had cracked the German Enigma cipher. The intelligence it produced, codenamed Ultra, flowed quietly into the hands of a select few, translated from intercepted radio traffic into operational gold. Every convoy routing, every supply manifest, every anxious signal from a German quartermaster struggling to keep Rommel's army alive, British analysts read it all. The sheer scope of what Ultra provided in the months leading up to El Alamein was staggering. By the late summer and early autumn of 1942, Signals intelligence teams had built a detailed portrait of the Axis order of battle, which divisions held which sectors, how many tanks remained operational, how many litres of fuel sat in forward depots, and crucially, how the morale of German and Italian forces was deteriorating under the combined pressure of overextension and Allied air interdiction. Rommel's Africa Corps was bleeding without anyone firing a shot at it. Supply ships were being sunk in the Mediterranean, and British analysts knew precisely which ships, carrying precisely what cargo, had gone to the bottom. The Germans knew their supply situation was grave. What they did not know was that the British knew it too, down to the last drum of fuel and the last crate of artillery shells. This intelligence asymmetry placed Montgomery in a position of remarkable strategic advantage, but it also imposed a burden. The intelligence had to be protected at almost any cost. If German signals officers ever suspected that Enigma had been compromised, the entire cipher system would change overnight, and the window would close. Every time ultra-intelligence informed a decision, that decision had to be attributed to conventional sources: aerial reconnaissance, prisoner interrogation, patrols. The deception ran in two directions simultaneously: deceiving the enemy about British intentions and deceiving the enemy about British knowledge. Montgomery's staff operated within this double constraint every single day, managing a secret that shaped every plan they made while ensuring the secret itself never surfaced. Aerial reconnaissance provided the public face of much of this intelligence work. Pilots flew daily sorties over Axis lines, their cameras recording the positions of vehicles, fortifications, and gun emplacements. The photographs were genuine, the analysis was genuine, and they served as the official explanation for British awareness of Axis dispositions that actually derived from Ultra. Ground patrols pushed into no man's land under cover of darkness, bringing back prisoners whose interrogations yielded useful tactical details. All of this was real, necessary, and valuable in its own right. But it was the signal's intelligence flowing from Bletchley Park that gave Montgomery's planners something no aerial photograph could provide: the enemy's own voice, unguarded and specific, discussing precisely the weaknesses that the British intended to exploit. Beyond pure intelligence collection, Montgomery's staff turned to active deception. The operation they designed was called Operation Bertram, and in its ambition and intricacy, it rivaled anything the British had attempted in the war to that point. The fundamental objective was straightforward to state and extraordinarily difficult to execute: convince Axis commanders that the main British offensive would come in the south, and that it would not begin until well into November. The actual attack would come in the north, in the final days of October. If Bertram succeeded, Rommel's forces would be misdeployed, his reserves oriented in the wrong direction, and his reaction fatally delayed in the critical opening hours of the assault. The physical construction of the deception was a logistical undertaking in itself. Hundreds of dummy tanks were fabricated from canvas and timber frames and positioned in the southern sector of the British line, far from where the real armour was being assembled. From above, from the perspective of an Axis reconnaissance pilot scanning the desert from altitude, these constructions were indistinguishable from genuine armoured vehicles. Real tanks moving into their forward assembly areas were disguised as supply lorries, fitted with canvas superstructures that mimicked the profile of trucks. The mathematics of this exchange were carefully managed. Every genuine tank that moved forward was accompanied by a dummy lorry placed where the real lorry had been, so that the overall count of vehicles in any given area appeared stable to enemy observers. The desert floor was itself part of the illusion, and British engineers worked in relentless heat to ensure the tracks and disturbances left by real vehicles matched the story the British wanted to tell. Water and fuel pipelines tell their own story to a careful observer. You can estimate when an offensive will begin by watching how close the forward supply infrastructure has come to the front line. The British understood this, and so a dummy pipeline was constructed in the southern sector, laid at a pace calculated to suggest that it would not reach completion until well into November. The pipeline was real enough to photograph, real enough to study, real enough to deceive. It ran toward a sector of the front that would never see the main assault. Alongside it, dummy supply dumps grew steadily over weeks, stacked crates and containers that, examined from the air, appeared to represent the accumulation of stores necessary to sustain a major offensive operation. Every element was coordinated, every visible detail pointed south, and every visible timeline pointed late. Radio deception ran in parallel with the physical illusions. Signals units transmitted traffic patterns associated with headquarters and formations that were not where the transmissions suggested. A signals officer and a small team could impersonate the radio signature of an entire armored division. The volume of traffic, the timing of transmissions, the call signs, and procedural patterns that German signals intelligence analysts had learned to associate with particular British units. By generating the radio presence of formations in the south, while the actual formations prepared quietly in the north, under strict wireless silence, the British added an electronic dimension to the visual deception. Axis signals analysts, piecing together the picture from intercepted traffic, would see what the British wanted them to see. Strict control of information within British ranks reinforced the entire structure. Units preparing for the real assault operated under communications restrictions so severe that normal coordination was disrupted. Forward tank crews were not briefed on their actual objectives until the last possible moment. Supply convoys moved at night. Vehicle engines were muffled with additional covers in forward areas. Administrative traffic, the mundane radio chatter of an army going about its business, was maintained at levels that suggested routine activity rather than imminent offensive preparation. The silence was as carefully engineered as the noise being generated in the wrong places. Montgomery's staff understood that a deception is only as strong as its weakest link, and that a single careless transmission, a single talkative prisoner, could unravel months of meticulous work. The Italian and German intelligence staffs were not without resources of their own. Axis reconnaissance aircraft continued to fly over British positions when RAF fighters permitted them to do so, which was with decreasing frequency as British air superiority tightened through October. Ground agents operated in Egypt, though British counterintelligence had systematically rolled up most of the productive Axis networks operating in Cairo and Alexandria during the preceding months. The picture assembled by Axis intelligence officers was therefore built largely from what they could observe from the air, which was precisely the picture the British had constructed for them to find. Some Axis analysts expressed doubt. Some reports reaching German and Italian command posts noted anomalies, inconsistencies in the patterns of movement and supply. These cautionary voices were there in the record. They were not enough to override the dominant intelligence assessment, which had been carefully and patiently pointed in the wrong direction. As October deepened and the date of the offensive drew closer, the deception operation shifted into its most demanding phase. Final assembly of armor and infantry in the northern sector intensified, while the false picture in the south was maintained and, where possible, reinforced. British commanders knew that the window between detection and assault had to remain closed until the opening barrage made concealment irrelevant. Every day that passed without Axis forces repositioning to meet the real threat was another day the deception held. The pressure on the intelligence and deception staffs was immense, not the pressure of combat, but the quieter, relentless pressure of people who understood exactly what failure would cost in lives. When the night of the 23rd of October finally arrived, and 900 guns opened fire along the northern sector of the El Alamein line, the deception had done its work. Axis reserves were not optimally positioned to respond to the assault that actually came. The opening hours of an offensive are the hours when defenders most need clarity, speed, and the right units in the right places. On that night, Axis commanders had none of those things with the precision the crisis demanded. The intelligence machinery at Bletchley Park, the canvas tanks baking in the southern sun, the phantom radio transmissions, the pipeline that led nowhere, all of it converged in the chaos and firelight of a desert night to give Montgomery the one advantage no amount of guns could manufacture on its own: time. Time to punch through before the enemy fully understood where the blow had fallen. By late September of 1942, two armies stood poised across the narrow desert corridor of El Alamein, separated by minefields and the weight of their own expectations. They were not evenly matched. The disparity in strength had become as undeniable as the desert sun, and this imbalance would shape everything that followed. On the British side, General Bernard Montgomery commanded the Eighth Army, a force that had grown steadily larger with each passing week as reinforcements poured in from Britain, from Canada, from Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. The transformation was visible in the camps and supply depots spread across the desert. It was tangible in the confidence of soldiers who now felt equipped rather than improvised. Montgomery had inherited an army in crisis, demoralized by retreat and defeat, and through relentless reorganization and the arrival of fresh materiel, he had forged it into something formidable. By the final weeks of September, the Eighth Army had swelled to roughly 220,000 men, a staggering force for desert operations, where vast distances and limited supply routes created perpetual constraints on how many troops could actually be supported in combat. This vast body of soldiers was equipped with increasingly modern weapons and armor. The tank force, which had been desperately inadequate only months earlier, had grown to approximately 1,000 machines, Crusaders, Valentines, and Matildas, augmented by the arrival of American-supplied Grants and the first Sherman tanks, which represented a genuine leap in technological capability. These were not the most advanced tanks in the world, but they possessed adequate firepower, reasonable armor protection, and reliability that earlier British designs had often lacked. The sheer number alone created an unprecedented advantage. Axis forces could no longer hope to achieve localized armor superiority through concentrated deployment of better machines. British artillery had been reinforced and reorganized as well. Montgomery had dramatically increased the density of guns per mile of front, creating the potential for overwhelming firepower concentration. The reorganization of the Royal Artillery mirrored Montgomery's philosophy: massed, coordinated, devastating. Where previous British commanders had distributed artillery in penny packets across divisional sectors, Montgomery concentrated it under army-level command, enabling the kind of coordinated barrages that would become the signature of his operational approach. The Air Force supporting the Eighth Army represented perhaps the most decisive advantage of all. British and American squadrons operating from fields near Cairo and the Canal Zone provided air superiority that was becoming increasingly absolute. Spitfires and Hurricane fighters dominated daylight operations. Beaufighters and other twin-engine fighters conducted night operations. The Axis Air Force in North Africa was withering, starved for fuel, replacement aircraft, and trained pilots. German and Italian aircraft that appeared over the British lines faced enemies with superior numbers, better logistics, and the advantage of fighting above friendly territory, where pilots shot down could be recovered and returned to service. This growing disparity in air power meant that British movements became increasingly difficult for the Axis to observe, while German and Italian dispositions lay open to constant reconnaissance. The Eighth Army's supply lines, stretching from Alexandria and Port Said through the desert, were increasingly secure. The Axis Air Force lacked the strength to interdict them systematically. The personnel composing the Eighth Army reflected the far-flung nature of the British Empire and Commonwealth at war. Infantry and armour regiments bore the names of British counties and Scottish Highlands, but beside them stood Australian divisions, tough and battle-tested from earlier North African campaigns and from the desperate struggles in Burma and the Pacific. New Zealand formations brought a fierce pride and military tradition spanning generations. South African units added their strength and experience of African warfare. Canadian forces, recently arrived from Britain, brought training and equipment from North American sources. Indian divisions contributed both infantry and specialized units. This heterogeneous force was unified under Montgomery's command structure, bound together by common purpose and the arrival of clear, comprehensible orders. The psychological impact of this multinational force should not be underestimated. Soldiers from across the British world were gathering for a decisive engagement, and many understood that this battle would determine whether fascism would spread to their own homelands or whether it could be rolled back. The logistical apparatus supporting the Eighth Army had been revolutionized. Montgomery had inherited a supply system in chaos. Lines of communication stretched beyond their capacity, transport inadequate, storage depots disorganized. He had reorganized the logistics system with the same intensity he brought to tactical matters, appointing capable staff officers to manage the movement of ammunition, fuel, food, and spare parts. The result was a machine that, while never perfect, functioned with mechanical reliability that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Ammunition reserves grew to unprecedented levels. Fuel dumps expanded across the desert. Spare parts became available rather than scarce. This logistical superiority meant that the Eighth Army could sustain intense combat operations far longer than Axis forces, could replace losses in equipment and supplies that would permanently cripple lesser armies. A modern army travels on its supply lines as truly as any historical caravan, and the British supply lines were now robust and expanding daily. Across the minefield barrier, the Axis forces under Rommel's nominal command presented a strikingly different picture. The Deutsches Afrika Korps, the German expeditionary force in North Africa, had once been the finest instrument of mobile warfare in the world. Rommel himself represented the peak of German military capability, a general respected even by his enemies for tactical brilliance and aggressive leadership. But by September 1942, even Rommel's talents could not overcome the fundamental constraints of his strategic position. The Axis force in North Africa numbered roughly 110,000 men, approximately half the strength of the Eighth Army. German forces comprised perhaps 40,000 troops, with the remainder consisting of Italian divisions of varying quality and capability. The tank force available to Rommel had been estimated at roughly 500 machines, again, roughly half the British armour strength. On the surface, these might seem respectable numbers, but context revealed the desperate situation. German divisions in North Africa operated at roughly 70 to 80% of authorized strength. Many units had been in continuous combat for months without rest or rotation. The replacements arriving from Europe were often poorly trained and unfamiliar with desert warfare. The equipment situation for Axis forces was similarly constrained. German Panzer tanks, the Mark III with its 5-centimeter gun and the Mark IV with its more powerful armament, were good machines, but they were fewer in number and increasingly troubled by wear and maintenance issues after months of desert operations. Italian armour consisted largely of older tanks that were decidedly inferior to their British counterparts. Anti-tank guns, both German and Italian, were adequate but in limited numbers. The Germans relied heavily on the 88mm anti-aircraft gun, which had proven devastatingly effective in anti-tank role, but these were too few and tied to fixed positions. The Axis forces lacked the American-supplied vehicles that British forces possessed. Vehicles that had failed or been damaged often could not be replaced because replacement parts were not available. Every vehicle lost in combat represented a permanent reduction in strength unless it could be repaired with salvaged parts. The contrast between the abundant play of British resources and the perpetual scarcity of Axis supplies could be measured in 1,000 different ways: fuel ration sizes, ammunition per gun per day, replacement vehicles per division per month. The condition of Axis personnel reflected the strain of sustained desert warfare without relief. German soldiers had been fighting in North Africa for extended periods. Combat fatigue was widespread, despite the professionalism of the German army. Many experienced officers and non-commissioned officers had been killed or wounded and evacuated. Their replacements were often less capable. Italian soldiers, brave enough in action but less well equipped and led, suffered from the knowledge that they were far from home in a campaign that seemed increasingly hopeless. Morale among Axis forces was declining noticeably by late September. The constant British air superiority meant that soldiers lived under threat of air attack. Supply convoys were attacked regularly. Movement by day became increasingly dangerous. The knowledge that they were increasingly outnumbered in men and materiel created a sense of encirclement, despite the fact that they held nominally defensive positions. Rommel himself, in a period of poor health, had been granted leave to return to Germany in late September. The departure of the commander who embodied German military will had its own psychological impact, even though it would soon be reversed. Rommel's absence and the broader Axis command structure reflected deeper problems in German military organization. Italy was technically a co-belligerent, but Italian forces in North Africa operated under a confused command structure where German orders and Italian preferences often conflicted. Italian generals commanded Italian divisions, but these divisions were ultimately under Rommel's operational authority, creating friction and misunderstanding. German forces, nominally under Italian theatre command, often bypassed Italian headquarters entirely in dealing with Berlin. The confusion was particularly acute regarding supply priorities. German divisions received supplies ahead of Italian units, creating resentment. The High Command in Rome was increasingly skeptical of the North African campaign. Many Italian military leaders believed that resources would be better allocated to defending Italian homeland security or maintaining Italian prestige in the Mediterranean. This lack of unified purpose at the highest levels filtered downward, creating uncertainty in lower formations about whether the North African front would be properly supported or gradually abandoned. The supply situation for Axis forces had become critical by late September. Ships carrying supplies across the Mediterranean faced British submarines and aircraft based in Malta and Egypt. Merchant vessels were being sunk with alarming frequency. The Italian Navy, once formidable, had been badly damaged by earlier naval actions and British air attacks. It lacked the strength to protect supply convoys effectively. Fuel, in particular, had become desperately scarce. German and Italian vehicles required vast quantities of fuel. The desert distances meant that every operation consumed enormous quantities of gasoline and diesel. Rationing had been imposed. Vehicles were operated only when absolutely necessary. Long-distance movements were restricted. The shortages were so acute that Axis commanders had to calculate every movement, every tactical operation, in terms of fuel consumption. An aggressive armored operation that might have been routine in Europe became a luxury that consumed fuel reserves needed for basic supply distribution. Ammunition shortages were less acute than fuel, but still concerning. The Axis forces could not afford the kind of intense bombardment that Montgomery was planning. The contrast between the two armies grew sharper with each passing day as September turned toward October. The Eighth Army continued to grow stronger as reinforcements arrived and supplies accumulated. The Axis forces, by contrast, were slowly being worn down by attrition and supply shortages. German and Italian commanders understood this grim arithmetic perfectly. The window for decisive action was closing. Rommel recognized that his army could not sustain prolonged combat with an enemy of superior strength and resources. If the British were to be defeated, it would have to occur quickly, before the disparity became insurmountable. This realization drove the German planning for Operation Ida, the final Axis offensive attempt in late August and early September. When that offensive failed, when British resistance proved stronger and more organized than anticipated, the strategic situation shifted fundamentally. The initiative, which had rested with Axis forces throughout the previous months, passed decisively to the British. Montgomery could now pursue his carefully laid plan, confident in superior strength and resources, knowing that time itself was working in his favor. The armies facing each other across the minefield barrier were no longer competitors in any meaningful sense. One was growing stronger, the other weaker, with each passing day. The numerical disparity would only increase as October approached. British reinforcements continued to arrive. Additional tanks and guns were being unloaded at Egyptian ports almost daily. Fresh infantry divisions were being integrated into the 8th Army's order of battle. The Axis, by contrast, could expect virtually no significant reinforcements. German divisions elsewhere on the continent could not be stripped to reinforce North Africa. Italy's own situation was deteriorating, with Allied threats to Sicily and southern Italy. Axis leaders in North Africa could count on what they already had, and nothing more. This imbalance meant that the British command could contemplate operations that would have been impossible earlier. They could afford casualties because they had reserves. They could sustain prolonged offensive operations because supply lines could support them. They could experiment with tactics and operations, knowing that success or failure would not mean strategic catastrophe. The Axis command, by contrast, moved within ever-tightening constraints, unable to afford significant losses, unable to sustain prolonged intense combat, unable to replace what was lost. In the grinding calculus of attrition warfare, the stronger side almost always wins, and by late September, the 8th Army had become comprehensively stronger than the Axis forces opposing it. The coming battle would be decided not by tactical brilliance or operational maneuver, but by the patient application of overwhelming material and manpower superiority against an opponent without reserves, without reinforcements, and without the luxury of retreat. The desert in early October 1942 carries a weight that no sandstorm can match. Across North Africa, from the Mediterranean coast to the Qattara Depression, two armies stand poised at a threshold. Neither can retreat from any longer. For the British and Commonwealth forces, months of humiliation have accumulated like dust on a soldier's uniform. The long retreat from France, the evacuation from Greece, the disaster at Tobruk where thousands surrendered to a force they outnumbered. These memories live in the consciousness of every man who wears a British uniform, and the promise of reversal electrifies the air more powerfully than any radio broadcast. For the Germans and Italians, the situation presents a different kind of psychological pressure. They have tasted victory for so long that the mere possibility of defeat feels like a foreign concept, yet the mathematics of supply and distance have begun to whisper uncomfortable truths. The reinforcements that should arrive do not come in sufficient numbers. The fuel that should fill the tanks arrives in diminishing quantities. The sense of unlimited momentum that carried Rommel's armies across the desert begins to falter almost imperceptibly. General Bernard Montgomery understands that victory will belong not to the army that desires it most passionately, but to the army that prepares most methodically. His command post becomes a hub of calculated activity where every detail receives scrutiny that would have seemed excessive to his predecessor. The Eighth Army, having spent weeks receiving new formations, new equipment, and new hope, now enters the final phase of preparation where theory must transform into muscle memory and confidence. Across the sprawling camps that dot the Egyptian desert, commanders at every level gather their men for detailed briefings. Maps marked with grid references, minefields, enemy positions, and objectives hang in briefing tents where officers explain what is expected of them with a clarity that seems almost shocking to men accustomed to orders that shifted with each change in tactical fashion. The emphasis falls on objectives rather than results, on clear sequential phases rather than flexible adaptation. Montgomery has engineered a command philosophy that removes ambiguity from the battlefield, a radical departure from the improvisation that characterized the earlier campaign. Each brigade knows precisely which company will attack which position. Each company knows the distance it must cover and the defenses it must overcome. Each soldier understands that success depends not on individual initiative, but on collective discipline. The training regimens intensify across the last week of September and into the first days of October. Tank crews practice coordinated movements through minefield gaps marked by white tape, rehearsing the delicate balance between speed and caution that will determine survival when live fire replaces the training ground's safety. Anti-tank gunners drill on stationary and moving targets, their muscles memorizing the sequence of adjustments and corrections that separates a hit from a miss under the conditions they will actually face. Infantry sections practice night approaches across open ground, using the darkness to teach soldiers how to move silently and maintain formation when vision extends only a few meters. Machine gun teams conduct fire concentration drills where multiple weapons synchronize their sheets of fire to create impenetrable walls of steel. Sappers and engineers work methodically through their own routines, studying the precise patterns of minefield clearance that will create the corridors through which infantry will advance. The repetition is exhausting and sometimes seems pointless to men who have endured combat, but the methodology contains a hidden logic. When the actual battle arrives and fatigue clouds judgment and fear threatens to shatter nerve, the body remembers what the mind can no longer think clearly about. Yet preparation remains incomplete without the arrival of material. Throughout late September, ships carrying tanks, guns, and vehicles continue to arrive at Alexandria and Port Said, their cargo representing the full industrial might of Britain and the promise of American production. The new tanks are superior to the vehicles they replace, featuring more effective guns and thicker armor. The anti-tank weapons possess greater velocity and penetrating power than the older models. The artillery pieces promise greater range and accuracy. Each arrival generates quiet satisfaction among officers who understand that these machines represent the shift in material balance that no amount of German tactical brilliance can overcome. Supply depots swell with ammunition, fuel, and rations. The Quartermaster Corps orchestrates a logistics operation of stunning complexity, ensuring that when the attack begins, the forward units will not discover that critical supplies have been overlooked. Water trucks position themselves to deliver the vast quantities that desert warfare demands. Medical facilities establish casualty collection points and field hospitals, an acknowledgement that wounded men will soon need care. The entire army becomes a machine for projection of force, and every component receives attention proportional to its importance. The intelligence picture sharpens during these final days before the offensive. At Bletchley Park in England, the cryptanalysts continue their work against Axis radio communications, providing details about German and Italian positions, supply movements, and personnel rotations. The ultra-intercepts confirm that Rommel has departed Egypt for Europe, a fact that Montgomery's staff catalogues with careful attention. They note the movements of German units and Italian formations, understanding that while Rommel's absence cannot eliminate German competence, it does remove the presence of one particular opponent whose operational genius has generated disproportionate concern. The Air Force Intelligence Service provides aerial photographs that reveal minefield patterns, gun positions, and defensive works with clarity that would have seemed miraculous only months earlier. This accumulation of knowledge about the enemy's situation, dispositions, and capabilities creates an asymmetry that favors the British. The Axis commander will be forced to make decisions based on incomplete information and false assumptions, while Montgomery's decisions rest on the most detailed and accurate intelligence available to any general in 1942. Simultaneously, Montgomery's own deception staff orchestrates Operation Bertram, an elaborate construction of false units, dummy vehicles, and misleading radio traffic designed to misdirect German attention. Inflatable tanks, crafted with meticulous attention to detail, populate areas far from where the actual assault will occur. Wireless operators transmit messages that suggest British concentrations in the south, near the Katara Depression, where the terrain offers little advantage to attackers. Real vehicles are moved at night and concealed during daylight hours, creating the impression that British armour concentrations are smaller and differently distributed than reality. Supply dumps receive camouflage that renders them nearly invisible from the air, while carefully positioned dummy dumps are arranged precisely where Axis reconnaissance aircraft will discover them. The deception aims at a specific objective: to convince the German High Command that the British attack will focus on the southern flank and that the assault will not commence before the second week of November. If this deception succeeds, German units may be positioned incorrectly when the actual attack begins, and the crucial first hours will provide British forces with advantages that can never be replicated once combat begins. Across the minefield system itself, British engineers continue their painstaking work despite the knowledge that any day could bring the opening of the offensive. They navigate through gaps in the Axis minefields that reconnaissance teams have identified, mapping the mine positions and marking safe corridors with coloured tape. The work is methodical and terrifying in equal measure, because a single misstep means death. Engineers work at night, when darkness reduces the possibility of Axis observation and gunfire, crawling across ground that could be their grave, probing sand with bayonets and mine detectors, identifying anti-personnel mines designed to maim and anti-tank mines designed to destroy vehicles. The gaps they create remain secret until the bombardment begins, known only to the engineers themselves and the senior commanders who will direct infantry through them. This knowledge that they possess information of immense value, that their work directly determines the success or failure of the coming operation, sustains the sappers through the tension of waiting. On the German and Italian side, the atmosphere grows increasingly fraught with anxiety and frustrated urgency. Rommel's absence creates a command void that his Deputy General Georg Stummer attempts to fill with bureaucratic competence, but lacks the stature to occupy with true authority. Reports accumulate about the British build-up, about reinforcements arriving daily, about supplies being positioned ever closer to the front. German intelligence correctly surmises that a major British offensive is coming, but the exact timing and location remain uncertain. Axis commanders strengthen the minefield defences, deepening and widening the anti-tank ditches, positioning more guns in carefully concealed locations, and attempting to concentrate reserves where they judge the British will attack. Yet resources are constrained by supply limitations that no amount of effort can overcome. Fuel reserves are calculated and recalculated with growing concern. The Mediterranean supply lines are taking losses to British submarines and aircraft that have grown bolder and more effective as the weeks pass. Ammunition supplies are husbanded carefully, with the understanding that once the battle begins, consumption will accelerate beyond the rate at which supplies can be delivered. The soldiers themselves, both British and German and Italian, sense the imminence of action with the prescience that men in armies always possess. British troops write letters home with the understanding that these may be the last words they send before violence consumes them. German soldiers check their equipment with the methodical precision of men who understand that readiness means survival. Italian troops, many of whom have absorbed months of uncertainty about whether they are fighting for conquest or merely survival, prepare themselves with a fatalism born of serving in a war that increasingly seems disconnected from the ideological certainties that initiated it. The camps grow quieter as October unfolds. The usual chatter and complaints diminish as every man withdraws into himself and confronts the knowledge that he will soon face fire. This psychological state, neither panic nor false confidence, but clear-eyed recognition of probable danger, characterizes armies at the moment when preparation ends and waiting begins. The night of the 22nd of October arrives with the weight of finality. British commanders receive the order that the offensive will commence in precisely 1 day. The message travels through the chain of command, from Montgomery's headquarters at Burg El Arab, through corps and division commanders, through brigade and battalion commanders, down to the platoon and section level, where soldiers learn that the waiting has ended. Vehicles that will transport assault troops receive final maintenance checks. Ammunition is distributed to forward positions with painstaking attention to quantities and types. Assault bridges and equipment receive positioning that accounts for the minefield system they will need to cross. Medical orderlies establish their stations and prepare supplies for the wounded they know they will treat. Artillery guns receive final calibration to ensure that the barrage will fall on intended targets rather than on the British troops who will advance behind it. Officers conduct final briefings where they emphasize the sequence of objectives and the importance of maintaining direction and cohesion when chaos makes both seem impossible. The Axis commanders, meanwhile, receive reports throughout the day of the 22nd that indicate something is imminent. The deception operation has reduced certainty somewhat, but the volume of activity is too great to be entirely concealed. Rommel's absence is deeply felt as Stumme attempts to coordinate a defensive response without the singular authority that only Rommel possesses. Orders are issued to strengthen certain positions while maintaining reserves in locations determined by faulty assumptions about where the British will attack. No commander can be everywhere simultaneously, and the difficulty of commanding a force across minefields and broken terrain through interrupted communication means that many units will not fully understand what is happening until the artillery barrage announces it unmistakably. In the hours remaining before dawn breaks on the 23rd of October, Axis soldiers on the front line check their weapons one final time and settle into the knowledge that they will face attack soon, probably within hours, almost surely before the day concludes. The psychological burden of this moment bears down equally on both armies, though it expresses itself differently. For the British, the burden is anticipatory, months of frustration compressed into hours of waiting. For the Germans and Italians, the burden is one of foreboding, the sense that a crisis is arriving for which they are insufficiently prepared, that the material disparity will become apparent and decisive, that the long winning streak has finally reached its terminus. Officers on both sides walk through their positions during the night, observing men attempting to sleep, despite knowing that the next time they sleep might be in their graves. The conversation is muted, the jokes are thin. Every man understands that the next phase of this war begins in hours, that the stakes have moved beyond tactical advantage into the realm of strategic consequence. The Battle of El Alamein is about to commence, and neither army can retreat from what the next days will demand of them. The desert night of October the 23rd was absolute. No moon illuminated the sand, no breeze carried sound across the emptiness. Thousands of men lay in darkness, waiting. British and Commonwealth troops crouched behind gun positions, ammunition handlers standing ready with shells stacked in neat pyramids, officers checking watches with hands that would not stop shaking. Behind the British lines, the guns themselves sat silent, their long barrels pointed westward toward an enemy they could not see. Across no man's land, separated by minefield and darkness, German and Italian soldiers occupied their trenches and fortified positions, some sleeping fitfully, others alert and tense, all of them understanding that something momentous was about to occur. The psychological weight of the preceding months, British frustration at repeated retreats, German anxiety about uncertain supply, had condensed into this single moment of waiting. At 21:40 hours, that waiting would end in an explosion that would reshape the desert itself. The signal came not as a single gun's report, but as a detonation so massive and coordinated that it seemed the night itself had torn open. 900 British and Commonwealth guns, field artillery, medium artillery, heavy artillery, opened fire in perfect synchronization across a front that stretched for dozens of kilometers. The flash from the first volley illuminated the desert as though a false dawn had erupted from below the horizon. The sound arrived seconds later, a rolling wave of noise so intense that it bypassed human hearing and became instead a physical force, a pressure that soldiers felt in their chests and bones. Muzzle flashes lit the night in endless succession, creating a strobe-like landscape where shadows and light competed for dominance. The intensity was almost incomprehensible. 900 guns firing simultaneously, then reloading, then firing again. The rhythm became mechanical, industrial, the sound of overwhelming force applied with mathematical precision. What Rommel had feared most was materializing in the darkness. The British were employing their numerical superiority with ruthless efficiency. The artillery barrage consumed an almost unimaginable quantity of shells. Over a span of approximately 5.5 hours, British gunners and their Commonwealth counterparts delivered more than 500,000 shells into the Axis defensive positions. Each gun fired dozens of rounds, and the cumulative weight of explosives falling on a concentrated sector of the desert created an environment of absolute devastation. The ground trembled continuously. Dust rose in enormous clouds that caught the muzzle flashes and created an otherworldly orange haze suspended above the desert. The sheer quantity of ordnance being expended reflected months of logistical preparation, supply ships bringing ammunition from Britain, railways moving shells across Egypt and into the desert depots, trucks delivering rounds to gun positions. Every shell represented a decision made weeks earlier, a calculation that this amount of firepower would be necessary. Montgomery's staff had planned not for economy, but for overwhelming dominance, and now that plan was being executed with pitiless effectiveness. The effect on the receiving end was catastrophic and disorienting. German and Italian positions, despite being fortified, could not withstand the intensity of such a bombardment. Trenches collapsed, barbed wire was torn to shreds. Anti-tank guns were buried in sand or destroyed by direct hits. Communication lines between positions were severed. Ammunition dumps were struck and exploded in secondary detonations that sent shells arcing into the night sky. Personnel shelters, however well constructed, offered only marginal protection against such overwhelming firepower. Soldiers sheltering in trenches and dugouts experienced not just the explosions themselves, but the psychological terror of being utterly unable to respond or defend themselves. They were being annihilated by an enemy they could not see, could not reach, could not fight. The roar and fury continued for hour after hour, without pause or mercy. Men huddled in shelters and waited to die or to survive, with little control over which fate would be theirs. The barrage created a physical transformation of the battlefield itself. The carefully laid minefields that had defined the defensive landscape became churned and disarrayed, their positions shifted or buried deeper, their lethal order disrupted. Craters from exploding shells and mines created a lunar landscape across the Axis front. Dust and smoke hung so thick that visibility became measured in feet rather than tens of meters. The smell of explosives, sand, and burning material penetrated everything. The heat from the barrage warmed the desert night unnaturally. Communication systems were overwhelmed. German and Italian radio frequencies crackled with distorted voices, trying to report damage or call for help. Most messages never reaching their intended recipients. Officers who had carefully planned their defensive strategy found that their plans had become obsolete in the face of such overwhelming force. The Axis defenders realized with mounting dread that they were facing not a battle in any traditional sense, but an attempt at annihilation. The strategic purpose of the barrage extended far beyond simple destruction of enemy positions. Montgomery and his artillery commander knew that precision mattered less than overwhelming psychological impact. The barrage announced to every soldier in the Axis lines that the British possessed not just material superiority, but the absolute confidence to expend that material with lavish disregard. It communicated that resistance would be costly, that escape might be impossible, that the old calculus of desert warfare, rapid maneuver, flexible tactics, surprise, had been replaced by industrial-scale application of force. The barrage was intended to break not just fortifications but morale, to convince the defending forces that they faced a fundamentally different kind of opponent than they had encountered in previous engagements. Montgomery had studied the patterns of previous battles in North Africa and recognized that psychological shock, delivered through overwhelming firepower, could be as effective as tactical surprise. The guns were not simply destroying enemy positions, they were delivering a message written in fire and explosive force. As the barrage continued into the early morning hours of October the 24th, the scope of what was occurring became undeniable to all observers. British and American aircraft had not attacked. They were being held in reserve for daylight operations, where their effectiveness would be maximized. The assault was purely artillery, and it was purely British and Commonwealth force. Australian, South African, Canadian, and other Commonwealth gunners worked alongside British crews, all of them part of a coordinated whole that was applying military force on a scale that would have been impossible months earlier. The barrage's consistency was a revelation in itself. There were no pauses, no cessation. The guns cycled through their firing sequences without interruption. Ammunition bearers worked mechanically, their hands stained with cordite and powder burns. The gun crews were deafened by their own fire, communicating through hand signals rather than voices. The engineering that had gone into creating this system of destruction was extraordinary. Months of training, stockpiling of ammunition, positioning of guns, calculation of firing data, and coordination of schedules. All of it was now being realized in this 5.5-hour statement of raw military power. The Axis commanders recognized what was happening, but found themselves largely powerless to respond effectively. Rommel was not present. He was in Europe, returning to his command. The acting commander, General Georg Stumme, faced a nightmare scenario where his positions were being destroyed faster than they could call for supporting fire or adjust defensive positions. German artillery responded, but the British possessed significant advantage in gun numbers and ammunition stocks. Some Axis artillery was destroyed in place. Some was shifted backward to prepare for secondary defensive lines, but the fundamental reality was inescapable. The British were winning the opening exchange with overwhelming force. Orders were sent to units to prepare for the infantry assault that would inevitably follow, to reorganize around surviving positions, to prepare to either hold or withdraw. The uncertainty about what exactly the British intended, whether the assault would come at dawn, whether the bombardment would continue for hours more, whether reinforcements were being inserted elsewhere, added to the fog of confusion that the barrage had created. The behavior of individual soldiers in the receiving positions varied according to training, experience, and psychology. Some veterans of previous North African campaigns recognized what was occurring and tried to communicate to newer soldiers that such bombardments, while terrible, were eventually survivable. Some men became paralyzed with fear. Some attempted to maintain their posts despite the chaos, waiting for the moment when the barrage would lift and they could engage British troops. Some were already dead or dying from shrapnel or collapse of their shelters. Some officers maintained some semblance of order among their men, moving from shelter to shelter, checking on survivors, attempting to maintain chain of command. Others were casualties themselves, killed by shrapnel or by the psychological stress of command during such overwhelming attack. The experience varied enormously depending on position. Men in fortified bunkers had relatively better chance of survival than those in open trenches. Men in vehicles or exposed positions were nearly defenseless. The barrage treated all equally in one sense. It fell on fortified and unfortified positions alike, and yet the variations of survival and casualty were enormous. The British gunners, meanwhile, maintained their firing sequences despite the physical exhaustion that was beginning to set in. Ammunition handling in the darkness was dangerous work. A shell dropped on a stone or a shell case could detonate prematurely. A gun could malfunction under the stress of rapid fire. Crews could be killed by premature detonations or by their own gun's recoil if they were standing incorrectly. Yet the rhythm continued. Load, fire, adjust, load, fire. The discipline required was extraordinary. Many of these gun crews had trained for months, but training could not fully prepare them for the reality of firing continuously for more than 5 hours, while knowing that hundreds of thousands of other guns were firing simultaneously. The coordination was maintained through careful communication protocols and through the professionalism of the battery commanders and gun captains who checked firing data, ensured accuracy, and maintained discipline. Some guns malfunctioned and had to be repaired. Some crews were rotated for brief rest periods, but the overall barrage never ceased. It was as though 900 individual expressions of violence had been synchronized into a single, overwhelming statement of intent. The duration of the barrage was itself a demonstration of British logistical superiority. Earlier in the North African campaign, artillery bombardments of such intensity could be sustained for perhaps 30 minutes before ammunition was exhausted. The fact that this barrage continued for approximately 5.5 hours was a direct result of Montgomery's insistence on stockpiling adequate ammunition before the offensive began. Ships had arrived from Britain carrying shell after shell. Depots in Egypt had been established and filled with ordnance. Supply lines had been established specifically to support this barrage. The German and Italian commands understood this mathematics as well. They knew that such ammunition consumption could only be possible for a nation with substantial industrial capacity and uninterrupted supply lines. For the Axis defenders, watching their fortifications being systematically destroyed and knowing that the attacker possessed the means to continue this destruction for hours more, the psychological impact was profound. They were facing not just a better trained force or a more numerous force, but a fundamentally superior military machine, one with industrial backing, supply abundance, and confidence rooted in material superiority. As the barrage continued through the remaining darkness and into the dawn hours of October the 24th, observers noted that its character had evolved. The initial bombardment had been aimed at destroying positions and creating shock. As it continued, the fire became more focused on specific positions that had survived the initial assault, or on areas where Axis reinforcements might attempt to assemble. The artillery commanders were making real-time adjustments based on spotters' reports and on the developing situation. When German batteries returned fire, British counter-battery fire would shift to suppress them. When Axis positions attempted to reorganize and mount resistance, fresh tonnages of shells would pour down on those positions. The barrage was not a simple expression of rage or a predetermined schedule. It was an adaptive, evolving campaign of destruction that was being managed and adjusted as it unfolded. Montgomery's influence was present in every aspect of this coordination. The barrage reflected his insistence on meticulous planning, combined with clear command authority and disciplined execution. It was a demonstration of how military force, when applied with overwhelming quantity and precise coordination, could reshape the conditions of battle. When the barrage finally lifted at approximately 0300 hours on the 24th, the desert was transformed. The Axis positions that had been carefully prepared over weeks of labor were largely destroyed or disrupted. Fortifications had been reduced. Anti-tank positions had been overwhelmed. Supply dumps had been devastated. Ammunition stocks had been depleted or destroyed. Communications systems were in ruins. Casualty counts were still being established, but they were already estimated in the hundreds for immediate losses. The psychological impact on the Axis defenders was immediate and profound. They had endured an attack they could not resist, had been unable to inflict effective counterfire, and now faced the prospect of ground assault by forces that had just demonstrated overwhelming firepower dominance. Some survivors of the barrage would report that they had heard the sound of advancing British infantry even before the barrage had fully lifted, that the psychological terror of not knowing whether the assault would come immediately or whether more bombardment would follow was itself a weapon. The barrage had accomplished what Montgomery intended. It had broken the initial defensive positions, killed and wounded significant numbers of defenders, and shattered the psychological confidence that the Axis forces would be able to resist sustained British pressure. As dawn emerged over the desert, British infantry began moving forward into the devastated landscape, following paths that engineers had cleared through the minefield chaos. The opening barrage had announced that this would be a different kind of battle, and the Axis forces had experienced the announcement in 5.5 hours of fire and chaos. The artillery barrage that has torn apart the October night begins to fade as the first light of dawn approaches. For 5.5 hours, 900 guns have poured fire across the Axis positions, and now, in the relative silence that follows, A different kind of violence is about to unfold. The British and Commonwealth infantry regiments that have been waiting in their assembly areas, checking weapons and adjusting equipment in the darkness, now receive the signal to advance. They move forward into a landscape that has been fundamentally altered by bombardment, craters pocking the desert floor, dust hanging thick in the air, and everywhere, the evidence of a night of industrial destruction. The soldiers advancing through this devastated terrain carry rifles, bayonets, entrenching tools, and the knowledge that between them and the Axis defenders lies one of the most elaborate minefield complexes ever constructed. The psychological weight of this moment is immense. These are men who have retreated across North Africa for months, who have absorbed defeat after defeat, who have lost comrades and equipment and confidence. Now they are advancing toward entrenched enemy positions, and success depends not only on their courage, but on the precision of engineering work completed mere hours before. The sappers, or combat engineers, have labored under extraordinary pressure in the days leading up to this assault. Their task has been to identify safe passages through the minefield labyrinth, passages wide enough to allow infantry columns to move forward in reasonable order while remaining narrow enough that the enemy cannot pour devastating fire across them. The minefields themselves represent an engineering and organizational achievement of staggering proportions. Nearly 500,000 anti-personnel and anti-tank mines laid across the narrow corridor that stretches from the Mediterranean coast in the north to the impassable Qattara Depression in the south. These mines have been positioned with precision, with some arranged in patterns designed to force attacking infantry into kill zones where machine gun fire can be most effective. The sappers have used mine detectors, primitive mechanical devices that operate by detecting the magnetic signature of buried metal, to probe forward inch by inch, marking safe passages with white tape or painted rocks. This work has been conducted under constant enemy fire, with German and Italian defenders attempting to prevent the identification of gaps in their defensive network. The sappers have suffered significant casualties. Many have been killed or wounded while bent over their detectors, exposed and vulnerable to the fire of defenders who understand exactly what they are attempting to accomplish. As the infantry regiments begin their advance in the pre-dawn darkness, they move forward in columns organized along the marked passages. The discipline required to maintain formation and movement speed while navigating a minefield under fire is extraordinary. The men cannot afford to bunch together or deviate from the marked lanes. To do so means either detonating mines or presenting concentrated targets to enemy machine guns and artillery. Officers and sergeants keep their units moving forward, their voices carrying commands that must be heard over the continuing sound of explosions, gunfire, and the movement of thousands of boots across stony ground. The dust that hangs in the air obscures vision and direction. Soldiers rely on landmarks, on the soldiers in front of them, and on the leadership of their NCOs to maintain course. Behind the infantry columns come more sappers, working frantically to widen the passages, to remove mines, to create corridors that future waves of troops and eventually tanks can use to push deeper into the Axis defensive system. These engineers are themselves under fire. They work hunched over, moving carefully through passages that may contain unexploded mines or booby traps. The cost in engineering casualties is severe, but the passages must be opened or the entire assault will stall and collapse. The Axis defenders, despite the shock and disorientation inflicted by the artillery barrage, resist with determination and tactical awareness. German and Italian soldiers, dug into prepared positions, emerge from their shelters and dugouts and man machine guns, anti-tank guns, and light artillery pieces. They have expected an assault. The scale of the bombardment has announced this unmistakably, and while they may be disoriented and shaken, they are not paralyzed. The German defenders understand that the approaching British infantry is constrained to the marked minefield passages, and they concentrate their fire on these identified approaches. Machine gun fire rakes across the open passages. Anti-tank guns attempt to engage sappers and officers moving forward. Artillery, coordinated from command posts that remain functional despite the bombardment, drops shells on troop concentrations. The British infantry advance becomes a succession of engagements in which small units break off from the column to suppress fire from specific defensive positions. A platoon or company will assault a machine gun nest, using fire and maneuver to close with defenders who resist until they are overrun or forced to withdraw. These small battles are intense and costly. The infantry suffer casualties from machine gun fire, from shells, from the occasional mine that claims soldiers who deviate from safe passages. The coordination between infantry assault and artillery support becomes critical during these hours of fighting. Forward observers, attached to leading infantry units, identify enemy positions and call for supporting fire from the artillery batteries positioned behind the British lines. Shells arrive overhead and crash down on Axis positions, neutralizing machine gun positions or suppressing enemy fire long enough for infantry to advance. The artillery support, while invaluable, is also constrained by the limitations of communication and the difficulty of identifying targets in the darkness and dust. There are moments of tragic confusion when British artillery fire falls short or long, killing or wounding British soldiers advancing through the minefield passages. These incidents are unavoidable in the chaos of large-scale battle, and commanders accept them as the cost of modern warfare. By the time dawn begins to break and the darkness lifts, the British infantry regiments have penetrated the outer defensive zone. They have broken through the first line of Axis defences and advanced to positions in the central minefield area. The progress, however, has been costly and slow. The advance that Montgomery had hoped might be rapid and decisive has become methodical and grinding. The minefield passages that seemed manageable on the maps and in the planning tents have proven difficult to navigate under fire. Units have become mixed together as they have flowed through the same approach routes. Communication has become difficult. The momentum that commanders hoped to generate has been dissipated by the friction of combat and the constraints of the minefield landscape. By dawn on the 24th of October, the British have advanced perhaps 5 to 6 kilometers, penetrating part way through the minefield barrier. This represents a notable achievement. They have broken through Axis defences and sustained their assault despite casualties and resistance. But the outer defensive zone has not been fully breached. Behind the positions that the British have taken, there remains a second defensive line, deeper minefields, and more prepared positions where fresh Axis defenders wait in reserve. The inner defences remain intact, and the grinding character of this battle has already become apparent. The infantry regiments that have made this assault are exhausted. They have fought through the night, have navigated minefields under fire, have stormed defensive positions, and have suffered significant casualties in the process. Many officers and senior NCOs have been killed or wounded. Units are under strength and scattered. The terrain they have captured offers little shelter or protection. The desert continues its indifference to human suffering and ambition. The soldiers dig shallow slit trenches or take cover behind ridges and rocks, consolidating positions and preparing defences against Axis counterattacks that are likely to come. Water supplies are limited. Ammunition must be conserved. Medical personnel work furiously to treat the wounded, who cannot be immediately evacuated. The psychological mood is complex. There is satisfaction that the attack has succeeded in breaking initial resistance, but there is also apprehension about what comes next. The Axis inner defensive zone remains to be breached, and every soldier understands that fighting will continue and that casualties will mount. The sappers continue their work throughout the morning hours following dawn. They move forward behind the infantry, continuing to clear mines, widen passages, and prepare the way for the next phase of the assault. By mid-morning on the 24th, enough of the minefield barrier has been cleared to allow the first tanks to begin moving forward through the passages. This is a critical transition. The infantry assault alone cannot break through the remaining Axis defensive positions. Tank support will be required. The British and American supplied medium tanks, notably the Sherman and the Crusader variants, begin to push forward through the cleared passages, moving carefully and warily, following the marked routes and watching for anti-tank defences. The tank crews are aware that Axis anti-tank guns are waiting ahead, positioned to engage armour from prepared positions. The first tanks that push forward draw fire immediately. Some are hit, some continue forward, returning fire at distant muzzle flashes. The tank versus anti-tank duel begins to unfold across the minefield landscape, adding another dimension to the confused fighting that continues to consume the 24th of October. The integration of armour and infantry becomes the central challenge of the hours following dawn on the 24th. The tanks cannot move forward without infantry to suppress the anti-tank defences. The infantry cannot advance without tank fire to overcome enemy positions. The British commanders attempt to coordinate these two elements, pushing forward in a series of coordinated assaults where tanks and infantry move together, supporting each other, exploiting breakthroughs when they occur. This coordination is difficult to maintain in the dust and confusion of active combat. Units become separated, communication breaks down, and the intended coordination sometimes degenerates into a series of independent actions by platoons and companies fighting to overcome enemy resistance. The cost in casualties continues to mount. British infantry soldiers die clearing minefields, assaulting machine gun positions, and advancing through shell fire. Tank crews are killed when anti-tank rounds penetrate armour, causing fires inside vehicles that consume the men trapped within. Sappers are killed identifying and removing mines. Medics are killed treating wounded under fire. The cost is accumulating. Hundreds of British and Commonwealth casualties by mid-morning, more by afternoon, and the process will continue through the night and into the next day. The Axis defenders continue to resist, but their situation is becoming increasingly desperate. The initial shock of the artillery barrage has worn off, and the Germans and Italians now understand that a major breakthrough attempt is underway. Reserves are committed to shore up collapsing sections of the front. Commanders order local counterattacks to retake ground that has been lost. Attempts are made to seal breaches in the minefield that the British sappers have created. The cumulative damage from the artillery barrage, however, has rendered many positions untenable. Officers have been killed or wounded. Equipment has been destroyed or damaged. Unit cohesion has been degraded. The German and Italian soldiers, many of whom have already endured months of warfare in North Africa, face the prospect of sustained assault by a numerically superior enemy that is demonstrating increasing tactical competence. The morale impact of the massive artillery bombardment continues to resonate. Many defenders question whether a successful defense is even possible given the overwhelming firepower available to the British. By the middle of the afternoon on the 24th of October, the fundamental character of the fighting is becoming clear. This will not be a rapid breakthrough followed by mobile exploitation. This will instead be a slow, grinding, attritional battle in which small gains are purchased with significant casualties. The minefield barrier has acted as a brake on the British assault, forcing a methodical approach rather than allowing rapid penetration. The Axis defenders, despite their disadvantages, have adapted to the initial assault and are mounting determined resistance. The British infantry regiments and tank units that are engaging them are suffering casualties that will accumulate through the hours and days ahead. Montgomery's plan for a swift breakthrough is coming into contact with the reality of fortified defensive positions manned by soldiers determined to resist. The outcome of the battle is not yet determined. The fighting will continue, but the tempo and character of the engagement is already being shaped by the obstacles created by minefield, terrain, and prepared defense. As darkness falls again on the 24th of October, the infantry and sappers press forward in the continuing effort to penetrate the Axis defensive zone. The second night of the battle is beginning. The first day's assault has achieved some success in breaking through the outer defences, but the cost has been significant, and the inner defences remain to be broken. The British casualties from the infantry assault alone number in the thousands, killed, wounded, and missing. The Axis defenders have suffered similar losses from the artillery bombardment and subsequent fighting. Neither side has achieved a decisive victory, but the momentum is slowly shifting in the direction of the army that possesses superior numbers, better supplied forces, and the willingness to sustain casualties in a grinding war of attrition. The minefield passages, now widened through enormous effort and cost, will serve as the conduits through which the British push deeper into Axis territory in the days ahead. The breakthrough phase is ending. The battle of attrition is beginning. As the artillery barrage lifted in the early hours of the 24th of October, the British armour began to move. The infantry had done their work, punching through the outer defences of the Axis line and marking passages through the minefield. Now it was the tanks that would exploit those gains, pushing deeper into territory that Rommel had spent months fortifying. The night was still dark, illuminated only by moonlight and the occasional flash of distant explosions. Vision through tank periscopes was limited, grainy, unreliable, a challenge that British tankers would face for hours to come. The desert floor, churned by artillery fire and scarred by mine explosions, offered treacherous terrain that could immobilize vehicles or detonate mines that sappers had somehow missed. Yet forward they went, because pause meant death, and momentum, however fragile, was all the British had earned in those first grueling hours. The tanks pushing through the gap belonged mostly to the 23rd Armoured Brigade and units of the 10th Armoured Division. They were a mixture of Churchill infantry tanks, with their thicker armour and lower speed, and Crusader tanks that favoured mobility over protection. There were also American-supplied Grants and Lees, medium tanks that had arrived in significant numbers only within the preceding weeks and represented a substantial upgrade to British armoured capability. Each machine carried a crew of 5 or more men, packed into a steel box that grew suffocatingly hot under the desert sun and bitterly cold in the desert night. The commanders stood partially exposed in turrets, trying to navigate by landmarks and compass bearings that in the darkness amounted to educated guesses. Radio communication between tanks crackled with static and confusion as overlapping voices competed for transmission space, making coordination an exercise in improvisation rather than precision. The Axis defenders, initially stunned by the artillery barrage, were recovering quickly. German anti-tank gunners, positioned in prepared emplacements across the forward defences, began registering fire on the approaching British armour. The 88mm gun, that legendary weapon that had proven devastatingly effective throughout the North African campaign, sent rounds downrange at the silhouettes of British tanks moving against the moonlit sky. The sound was unmistakable, a crack like thunder, followed by the terrible screech of a high-velocity projectile traveling at terminal velocity. When an 88mm round struck a tank at that speed, the results were catastrophic. The impact often produced a flash of molten metal that sprayed through the crew compartment, or the round punched through the armor and detonated inside, turning the tank into a burning tomb. British tankers knew this. They had seen it before, yet they pressed forward because orders were orders, and because stopping meant allowing the Axis defenders to regain their composure. German panzer units, meanwhile, were attempting to mount their own counter-offensive. The Panzer IV, the main battle tank of the Afrika Korps, was a formidable machine, well-armored, reliable, and equipped with a capable gun. In open desert and under daylight conditions, Panzer IVs had proven more than a match for most British tanks. But this was not open desert, and this was not daylight. Fuel shortages imposed by the strangled Axis supply lines meant that German commanders could not assemble large concentrations of armor for coordinated counterattacks. Instead, panzer units were being fed into the battle piecemeal, in smaller groups that lacked the critical mass to achieve a breakthrough. The fuel rationing also meant that German tanks could not maneuver freely. Commanders had to calculate every kilometer of movement carefully, knowing that needless movement might leave them immobilized when the time came to fight. This constraint, born of logistical desperation, undermined the entire German philosophy of mechanized warfare. The confused night fighting that ensued across the minefield passages and their surroundings became a grinding, brutal affair. British and German tanks encountered each other at ranges sometimes measured in mere hundreds of meters, with visibility so poor that crews often did not see an enemy tank until it was nearly upon them. The moonlight, though helpful for general navigation, created shadows and obscured critical details that could mean the difference between a successful engagement and catastrophic loss. A British tanker might spot movement in the darkness, fire around, and seconds later see the orange flash of an anti-tank gun returning fire from an angle he had not anticipated. Communication between tank squadrons and companies broke down repeatedly as radio discipline gave way to the chaos of combat. Officers trying to coordinate movements found themselves unable to contact subordinates. Information about enemy positions arrived late or garbled. Contradictory orders circulated in different parts of the same formation. One engagement that occurred northwest of the El Alamein box illustrates the confused nature of this tank warfare. A troop of British crusaders, advancing in loose formation through a sector that sappers had supposedly cleared of mines, suddenly encountered a German anti-tank position. The British tanks attempted to maneuver, but in the darkness and on unfamiliar ground, maintaining formation proved nearly impossible. One crusader struck a mine that engineers had missed. The explosion blew off the tank's track and left it immobilized, its crew fighting to escape the vehicle before German guns could finish it. A second British tank, attempting to suppress the German position with machine gun fire, found itself suddenly confronted by a Panzer IV that had been positioned in the shroud of a ridge. The two tanks fired almost simultaneously, both rounds missing in the darkness. The second pass was more successful for the German gunner. A round struck the Crusaders' thinner armor, penetrated, and set the vehicle ablaze. The survivor crew bailed out and ran, leaving the tank to burn against the moonlit horizon. The British response to these setbacks was methodical and relentless. Rather than attempting to match the German style of mobile, breakthrough warfare that required fuel reserves Britain did not have, Montgomery and his subordinate commanders were conducting what amounted to a grinding, sequential penetration of the Axis defenses. Each company of infantry would advance to a certain objective, then tanks would move through behind them, suppress German positions, and allow the next infantry wave to push forward again. It was slow, costly in terms of casualties, but it matched British strengths: abundant artillery that could suppress enemy positions, industrial capacity to replace tank losses, and supply lines that, though stretched, still flowed more reliably than the Axis alternatives. The panzer units attempting counterattacks found themselves confronting not isolated tank squadrons that could be defeated in quick engagements, but entire formations supported by anti-tank guns, infantry with anti-tank rifles, and artillery that could rain fire on any concentration of German armour. By dawn on the 24th, when the moon had faded and the false light of approaching sunrise began to wash across the desert, the British tanks had pushed several kilometres into the Axis defensive zone. The minefield passages, though narrow and costly to maintain, had proven passable. Dozens of British tanks had been lost, and many more damaged. The casualty toll among crews was substantial, but the Axis defenders, despite their fixed positions and prepared defences, had not been able to stop the advance. German panzer counterattacks had been beaten back by artillery and by the sheer weight of numbers that British commanders could bring to any given sector. The German philosophy of rapid manoeuvre and the blitzkrieg tactics that had served so brilliantly in earlier campaigns had encountered an enemy who simply refused to break formation and could afford to trade casualties for progress. The daylight hours of the 24th brought a different kind of combat. Now the British could see targets clearly, and the superiority in numbers became even more apparent. German and Italian positions that had been hard to locate in darkness could now be identified and attacked methodically. British artillery, concentrating its fire, could suppress entire defensive sectors. Air attacks by the Royal Air Force, which had achieved clear superiority over the Luftwaffe in North Africa by this stage of the war, could strike German concentrations with relative impunity. The panzer units attempting to counter-concentrate for counterattacks found themselves under constant bombardment. A German commander attempting to organize a response to British penetrations would find his assembly areas being strafed by fighters or bombarded by artillery. Tanks and vehicles destroyed or damaged were difficult to recover or repair because mechanics could not work safely under constant fire. The momentum that had been achieved in the night continued through the daylight hours, pushing the Axis defenders further back and forcing German commanders to commit their remaining reserves just to prevent a complete breakthrough. The role of artillery in preventing German counteroffensives cannot be overstated. The British had concentrated massive gunpowder in support of the advance, hundreds of 25-pounder field guns, along with heavier pieces and anti-tank guns of various calibers. Whenever German tanks began to concentrate for a counterattack, observers would call in artillery strikes that forced the Germans to disperse. This required German commanders to choose between maintaining concentration strong enough to achieve a breakthrough or maintaining dispersal that prevented catastrophic losses to artillery. In practice, they could not achieve both, and the Axis forces gradually lost the ability to mount coordinated counteroffensives at all. Instead, they fought what amounted to a delaying action, trading space for time and hoping that British momentum would eventually peter out. But British momentum, surprisingly, did not peter out easily. Montgomery had committed substantial reserves to the breakthrough, and though losses were mounting, they were losses the Eighth Army could sustain and replace. The German and Italian forces, by contrast, were approaching the point where additional casualties would not be replaced. Every German tank destroyed meant one fewer tank available for future operations, and getting replacement tanks to North Africa was becoming an increasingly distant prospect. Fuel supplies were dwindling so drastically that some German units began caching vehicles in hidden positions, planning for the possibility that they might need to retreat and had better preserve what armor they could. It was a tacit acknowledgement that the strategic situation had shifted fundamentally. As the 24th of October gave way to the 25th, the British had established themselves solidly within the Axis defensive zone. The minefield passages had been widened, additional tanks and supporting vehicles had pushed through, and German attempts to counterattack had failed repeatedly. The night engagements and confused tanker battles of the first hours had given way to daylight operations, where British numerical and material superiority could be brought to bear more systematically. Panzer units that had hoped to exploit darkness and surprise found themselves instead in a grinding battle of attrition where their strengths, armor, training, and tactical proficiency could not compensate for the overwhelming disparity in resources. The Axis commanders faced a choice. They could continue defending positions that the British were steadily reducing, or they could begin considering withdrawal options. But withdrawal, under orders from Hitler, was not yet authorized. So the grinding, brutal progress continued, kilometer by kilometer, tank by tank, life by life. The artillery storm that illuminated the desert on the night of October 23rd had given way to a different kind of darkness by the following dawn. The initial barrage had achieved its psychological purpose, disorienting defenders and announcing with unmistakable finality that Montgomery's Eighth Army was committing to a full offensive. Yet as British and Commonwealth infantry regiments advanced through the minefield corridors cleared by engineers, reality began to diverge sharply from the optimistic calculations made during briefing sessions. The Axis forces, stunned but not broken, began to recover their composure. What had begun as a lightning thrust designed to punch through enemy defenses in a matter of days was transforming instead into something far more grinding and remorseless, a battle of material against material, of will against will, with no prospect of the rapid, decisive victory that planners had envisioned. By the afternoon of October 24th, the scope of the challenge before the British became increasingly apparent. German and Italian defenders, while disorganized and shocked by the intensity of the artillery bombardment, occupied multiple layers of defensive positions extending several miles inland from the coastal highway. They had occupied these positions for months, and in that time they had created obstacles that no single night of bombing could entirely eliminate. Anti-tank guns were positioned to command the approaches to every rise in the otherwise flat terrain. Machine gun nests covered every potential avenue of advance. Mines, in staggering quantities, lay beneath the sand waiting to rip apart the tanks and vehicles that pressed forward. The Axis commanders, whatever their disadvantages in numbers and supply, possessed the inherent defensive advantage of prepared positions. Montgomery's forces would have to overcome this advantage through sheer accumulation of effort and sacrifice, grinding forward kilometer after kilometer through coordinated infantry and armor assault. The battle was settling into a pattern that favored neither rapid British breakthrough nor dramatic German counterattack, but instead demanded that both armies commit themselves to a prolonged contest of attrition where strength of material and reserves of ammunition would ultimately determine the outcome. The fighting from October 24th through the 28th followed a rhythm that was as pitiless as it was monotonous. British infantry would advance against a particular section of the defensive line, supported by concentrated artillery fire that would pound the Axis positions for hours. The artillery would lift, and the infantry would charge across open ground toward the enemy trenches and gun positions. Some positions would fall, others would hold. When breakthroughs occurred, they were typically narrow and hard-won, measured in hundreds of meters rather than kilometers. British armor would attempt to exploit these gaps, pushing through the minefield corridors to widen them. But German panzer units, though outnumbered and fuel-starved, would organize counterattacks that forced bloody tank engagements. Then the cycle would repeat. British forces would consolidate captured ground, bring forward supply lines and ammunition, reorganize their units, and prepare for the next assault against the next line of prepared positions. This grinding process consumed men and machines at rates that were sobering even by the standards of the Second World War. A single regiment might advance 2 kilometers in an entire day and lose a quarter of its strength in the process. The casualty rolls mounted steadily, inexorably. The character of the battle was fundamentally different from the mobile warfare for which the desert was famous. Rommel had built his reputation in North Africa through rapid maneuver, through the sweeping flanking movements and the sudden concentrations of armor that had demoralized British forces in previous engagements. But the narrow corridor between the Mediterranean coast and the Qattara Depression compressed all movement into a corridor barely 30 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. There was no room for the elaborate turning movements that had characterized earlier desert campaigns. The minefields, those vast fields containing nearly 500,000 weapons, transformed the landscape into something resembling the static battlefields of the First World War, more than the fluid warfare of modern armored operations. Units that had trained for mobile combat found themselves instead fighting through densely packed defensive positions in what was essentially siege warfare. British soldiers adapted to this new reality with the professionalism that characterized the 8th Army under Montgomery's command, but the transformation was profound. The desert, which had promised freedom of maneuver and rapid decision, had become as constricting as any European trench system. German and Italian defenders understood that they were fighting for survival as well. Whatever the strategic calculations in Berlin or Rome, the men in the forward positions recognized that they were outnumbered and increasingly desperate in their circumstances. Italian forces, never as well equipped or supplied as their German counterparts, began to suffer disproportionate casualties. The Italian divisions were being steadily ground down under the weight of British assault, their older tanks and weaker anti-tank guns proving inadequate against the newer British armor. German commanders began pulling Italian units from the frontmost positions, substituting German forces that could conduct more effective defensive operations. This shift in the composition of the line was itself a symptom of the battle's attrition character. The Italians, despite their courage and commitment, simply could not sustain the casualty rates that the grinding warfare demanded. German units fared better defensively, but they too were bleeding away men, vehicles, and ammunition with each passing day. The defensive positions that had seemed so formidable on October 23rd were gradually being eroded by the sheer weight and persistence of British assault. Unknown to the men fighting in the desert, momentous decisions were unfolding in the highest command structures of the Axis forces. General Erwin Rommel, the legendary commander who had orchestrated the spring offensives and built the Axis position in North Africa, was absent from the battlefield during these critical early days. He had been on sick leave in Europe when the British offensive began, recovering from ailments brought on by the grinding demands of desert warfare. When it became clear that the battle was not proceeding according to Axis hopes, that the British breakthrough was not being rapidly contained, Berlin ordered Rommel to return immediately to North Africa to assume direct command of forces in the field. The decision reflected both the seriousness with which German high command regarded the situation and a certain desperation about the possibility that the current deputy commander, General Georg Stumme, might lack the tactical brilliance or force of will to arrest the British offensive. Stumme had been in command for only a short time, and while competent, he lacked the prestige and operational experience that Rommel possessed. Yet even as Rommel prepared to return to the desert, even as his aircraft raced across the Mediterranean toward North Africa, the battle was evolving in ways that neither he nor the British commanders could entirely control. General Georg Stumme, the German commander holding the line during Rommel's absence, would not survive to witness Rommel's return. On October 24th, during a reconnaissance of the forward positions, Stumme suffered a fatal heart attack while observing the intensity of the British assault. This was a loss far beyond the replacement of a single officer. Stumme had been struggling to manage a desperate situation with limited resources, and now that burden fell to junior commanders who lacked his authority. The German command structure in North Africa, already fragmented by distance and communication difficulties, became even more chaotic. Orders that Stumme might have issued were left unissued. Decisions that should have been made at the highest level devolved to battalion and regimental commanders operating with incomplete information about the overall situation. This fragmentation of command authority would have ripple effects throughout the remaining days of the battle. As the fighting progressed through October 25th and 26th, the scale of the attrition became even more apparent. The British were now bringing forward the results of their industrial capacity: fresh troops, new tanks, abundant ammunition, and comprehensive supply lines that remained fully functional despite the proximity of the fighting. The Axis forces, by contrast, were operating on bare rations. Fuel, the lifeblood of mobile warfare, was becoming desperately scarce. German commanders were forced to make agonizing decisions about which vehicles could remain mobile and which would have to be either abandoned or immobilized as stationary gun positions. Tank units that had numbered over 100 vehicles just days earlier were down to fewer than 50 operational machines. The firepower that German armor could bring to bear was therefore increasingly concentrated and defensive rather than aggressive and mobile. British tank losses were significant as well. The Eighth Army was not engaging in costless victory, but British factories were producing replacement vehicles far faster than German industry could match. The imbalance in material reserves was becoming the dominant fact of the battlefield. The infantry fighting during these 5 days was as bitter and consequential as the armor clashes, though often conducted beyond the view of journalists or photographers. British and Commonwealth infantrymen, including soldiers from Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and India, pushed forward through the darkness and dust of the desert nights, clearing enemy positions with grenades and bayonets, taking prisoners, and suffering heavy casualties themselves. German paratroopers of the Afrika Korps contested every position with fanatical determination, fighting from prepared defensive lines that they had constructed over months. These infantrymen were often exhausted. They had been engaged in continuous combat operations for days without adequate rest, yet they persisted in their assigned tasks. The casualty rates for frontline infantry units were appalling. Rifle companies that had numbered 120 men at the start of the battle were down to 60 or 70 men by October 26th. Battalions were losing their coherence and had to be withdrawn for reorganization. Whole regiments were being fed piecemeal into the grinding machinery of the assault to maintain momentum. The casualty rolls included not just those killed but vast numbers of wounded men who had to be evacuated to field hospitals, stretching medical facilities and removing men from combat strength indefinitely. The German response to this grinding pressure was constrained by factors beyond the control of any commander in the field. Adolf Hitler, observing the battle from his headquarters in Europe, issued orders that reflected his strategic vision rather than the tactical reality in North Africa. Hitler demanded that the line be held at all costs, that no retreat was to be contemplated, that German forces were to stand firm and defeat the British offensive through sheer force of will and determination. These orders, transmitted to the increasingly desperate German commanders in the desert, were essentially impossible to obey given the material situation. You cannot hold a line when your soldiers are running out of ammunition. You cannot conduct a successful defense when your tanks are immobilized for lack of fuel. You cannot defeat a superior force through determination when that force possesses more weapons, more ammunition, and more vehicles than you can possibly field. The orders created a tension between obedience to the Führer and military necessity that would torment German commanders throughout the remaining days of the battle. Officers had to decide whether to follow orders that would result in the annihilation of their forces or to exercise their judgment and attempt to preserve their armies for future operations. This tension, this agony of command, would define the German experience of the battle's final phase. The psychological dimension of the attrition was as significant as the material accumulation of casualties. British soldiers and officers, who had experienced defeat and retreat in earlier phases of the North African campaign, were gaining confidence with each day of successful attack. They could see their enemy weakening, see the destruction mounting on the Axis side, see the evidence of German and Italian exhaustion accumulating on the battlefield. Officers were able to communicate to their men that the situation was improving, that the Eighth Army was prevailing, that continued effort would lead to victory. This morale boost, however modest it might seem in abstract terms, was nonetheless consequential in a battle of attrition where willingness to continue fighting was itself a critical factor. The Axis forces, conversely, were experiencing the psychological weight of slow defeat. Every day that passed without a successful German counteroffensive, without relief from the British pressure, meant that hope for ultimate victory in the sector diminished a little further. Prisoners captured during these days often expressed hopelessness about the future, described inadequate supplies, mentioned the absence of reinforcements, spoke of their confidence that the British would eventually overwhelm them through sheer weight of numbers. The attrition of hope ran parallel to the attrition of men and machines. By the 28th of October, after 5 days of grinding battle, the situation had become clarified in ways that were evident even to commanders in the field. The British forces were still pushing forward, still maintaining their assault, still able to organize new attacks with freshly arrived regiments and armor formations. The Axis defenders were weakening perceptibly. Tank losses were mounting to the point where German and Italian armor would soon be a negligible factor on the battlefield. Infantry units were being whittled away by continuous casualty rates that could not be replaced. Ammunition supplies were becoming critically short, forcing commanders to impose rationing on artillery fire. And still, Hitler's orders commanded that the line be held. The Eighth Army's offensive was beginning to lose something of its initial momentum. Battles of this kind develop a rhythm and an inertia, and pushing through the dense minefield zones and heavily defended positions had imposed significant costs on British attacking units as well. But the British possessed reserves that the Axis did not. The Germans could not replace losses, the British could. This simple mathematical reality was the dominant fact of October 24th through October 28th. It was a reality that no amount of German tactical skill or Italian courage could overcome. The battle was evolving from a crisis of command decisions and operational maneuver into a raw test of which side possessed greater reserves of men and material. In such a contest, only the outcome was ever in doubt. By the 25th of October, the battle had already consumed 5 days of relentless fighting. British artillery bombardments continued. Infantry and armor pressed forward into the Axis defensive lines, and the desert floor, once swept clean by wind and sand, now churned beneath the treads of hundreds of tanks and the boots of thousands of soldiers engaged in the grinding work of modern warfare. Yet in Europe, in a hospital room outside Berlin, a man lay recovering from abdominal surgery who would soon reshape the course of this desert engagement through his sheer force of personality and his capacity to see tactical realities that others either could not perceive or dared not acknowledge. General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had been absent from North Africa for weeks, convalescing in Germany, while his deputy attempted to hold the line against the British onslaught. The news that Montgomery's offensive had begun with such overwhelming force that casualties were mounting and that the strategic situation was deteriorating by the hour, finally compelled Adolf Hitler to make a decision that would have profound consequences for both Rommel and the Axis cause in North Africa. The summons came with the urgency that only Hitler could convey. Rommel was told that his presence was required immediately, that the situation demanded his return, that his subordinates were struggling under the weight of British pressure. The journey itself was a logistical undertaking, an aircraft flight across Europe, then a longer passage across the Mediterranean, with its attendant dangers from British air power and naval forces. Rommel departed Germany with foreknowledge that the battle was not proceeding according to any plan that might have been established before he left. His deputy, General Georg Stumme, had initially attempted to sustain the defense with the forces at hand. The reports reaching Germany indicated that Stumme was dealing with an unprecedented barrage of artillery, that British infantry had penetrated the outer defensive zones, and that German and Italian units were absorbing casualties faster than they could be replaced. Yet Stumme himself would not survive long enough to meet Rommel. During the fighting on the 24th of October, Stumme suffered a heart attack, collapsing under the stress of command during a crisis. His death created a void in Axis leadership, at the precise moment when coordinated command was most essential, a circumstance that accelerated the recall of Rommel and underscored the gravity with which Berlin regarded the North African situation. When Rommel's aircraft touched down at Axis airfields in North Africa on the 25th of October, he stepped out into a landscape transformed since his departure months earlier. The desert air was thick with smoke from burning vehicles and exploding artillery shells. Ambulances moved constantly, ferrying wounded to medical facilities already overwhelmed by the scale of casualties. The mood among Axis officers was one of barely suppressed anxiety, a recognition that something fundamental had shifted in the balance of forces. Rommel wasted no time in preliminaries. He immediately demanded briefings on the tactical situation, on supply status, on unit strengths and dispositions, and on the intentions of his commanders. What emerged from these briefings was a portrait of a military machine under severe stress, one that had been pushed to the limit of its capacity and was beginning to show signs of fracture. The British had achieved their objectives in the first phase of the offensive. They had penetrated the outer defensive positions, inflicted heavy casualties, and maintained the initiative despite the ferocity of German and Italian resistance. The supply situation painted a particularly grim picture, one that would dominate Rommel's thinking from the moment he resumed command. Axis forces in North Africa depended entirely on a logistical pipeline that stretched across the Mediterranean from Italy, a route vulnerable to British naval forces and increasingly effective British air power. During the months preceding the El Alamein battle, that pipeline had grown progressively more tenuous. Ships carrying fuel, ammunition, food, and replacement troops were being sunk with alarming regularity. The submarine threat was constant. The air threat from bases in Egypt and beyond was relentless. When Rommel reviewed the actual stocks of fuel available to Axis forces, the numbers were shocking. Gasoline reserves were measured in days, not weeks. Panzer divisions, the cutting edge of German military capability, were immobilized or severely rationed in their fuel consumption. This meant that the kind of mobile warfare at which Rommel excelled, the sweeping maneuvers and rapid counterattacks that had made his reputation in the desert, was now impossible. The German army that Rommel remembered and commanded was materially constrained in ways that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. Rommel understood, with the clarity that comes from long experience and unsentimental assessment, what these facts meant for the battle ahead. The Axis forces could not mount a decisive counteroffensive because they lacked the fuel to maneuver and the ammunition to sustain a major engagement for any extended period. The British, by contrast, had supplies flowing in from their bases in Egypt, had air superiority that was almost complete, and possessed numerical superiority in both personnel and equipment that was growing larger with each passing day. The most rational military decision, the one that would preserve what remained of the Axis armies in North Africa and maintain their capacity to fight future engagements, was to begin a controlled withdrawal westward. Such a withdrawal could be executed methodically, with rearguards trading ground for time, allowing the bulk of the force to escape encirclement and establish new defensive positions further west, where supply lines would be shorter and the military situation potentially more tenable. This was the solution that professional military judgment suggested, the one that Rommel himself recognized as the only viable path forward given the material constraints facing Axis forces. But Rommel also understood something else with perfect clarity. Adolf Hitler would never authorize such a withdrawal. Hitler's approach to military problems was driven by will, by ideological conviction, by an unwillingness to accept setback or acknowledge limitation. Hitler believed that German forces could accomplish anything if commanded with sufficient determination and if the will to victory remained unshakable. Retreat, in Hitler's worldview, was a counsel of despair, a confession of weakness that would spread defeatism through the ranks and undermine the spiritual force that Hitler believed sustained German military power. The Führer had already made his position known to the German High Command. Axis forces were to hold the line at El Alamein at all costs. If supplies were inadequate, then soldiers would fight with less supplies. If reinforcements could not be delivered, then existing units would hold with their current strength. There would be no withdrawal, no retreat, no negotiated settlement. The line would be held because it must be held, because German will and German courage could overcome material shortage if the command from above was sufficiently absolute. Rommel found himself trapped between two irreconcilable realities. As a military professional, he recognized the objective situation. Axis forces were materially inferior, supplies were inadequate, and withdrawal was the only rational response to British offensive pressure. As a German general under Hitler's supreme command, he was obligated to obey orders that demanded the line be held. The tension between these two positions created a psychological and strategic paralysis. Rommel could not order a withdrawal without explicit authorization from Hitler, yet requesting such authorization when he knew Hitler would refuse it seemed futile. To ask for permission to retreat was to invite a categorical refusal and possibly to incur Hitler's displeasure for suggesting anything other than unconditional commitment to holding the positions at any cost. Rommel had experienced before the consequences of suggesting military reality to Hitler when that reality contradicted the Führer's intentions, and he had no desire to repeat that experience. The result was that Rommel found himself fighting a battle he believed was unwinnable, using tactics he knew were inadequate, constrained by orders he could not disobey but could not fully accept. Over the following days, as the battle continued and British pressure mounted, Rommel attempted to work within these constraints. He organized counterattacks using German panzer units in an effort to drive back the British breakthrough, but the counterattacks founded on the realities of fuel shortage, superior British artillery, and the lack of numerical superiority. He tried to consolidate the defense by reorganizing unit dispositions, but there were only so many ways to strengthen a position when personnel and ammunition were both running short. He endeavored to maintain the morale of his forces, but soldiers can only sustain commitment to a hopeless task for so long before they begin to sense that hope is truly gone. With each passing day, Rommel's correspondence with Berlin became more urgent, more explicit in its assessment of the tactical situation, but his pleas for reconsideration of Hitler's orders fell on ears that would not hear them. Hitler remained convinced that Axis forces could hold the line. Rommel became increasingly convinced that they could not, but he was powerless to act on that conviction without direct authorization. The irony was that Rommel's very return to command, though necessary and initially welcomed by German officers, brought into sharp focus the contradiction between military reality and political requirement. A lesser commander might have accepted Hitler's orders without question and attempted to execute them as thoroughly as possible. But Rommel was not a lesser commander. His tactical abilities and his reputation for decisive action meant that his assessment of the situation carried weight, that his judgments were taken seriously even when they brought unwelcome news. Yet that very seriousness of assessment made his position more painful. He could see clearly what needed to be done. He was simply forbidden from doing it. The paralysis of command that resulted from this contradiction would define the remainder of Rommel's time in North Africa. He would continue to fight, continue to resist the British advance with whatever resources remained available. But he would do so, knowing that the outcome was essentially predetermined, that the constraints placed on his actions by Hitler's orders made defeat inevitable. By the 26th of October, barely a day after Rommel had resumed command, it was clear that the initial German counterattacks would not achieve the breakthrough that Berlin hoped for. The British continued to press forward. More Axis soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured, and the supply situation continued to deteriorate with each passing day. Rommel recognized that he was managing a slow catastrophe, that the best he could hope to do was to minimize the damage and preserve as much of his force as possible for future operations. Yet he could not say this openly to Berlin. He could not act on this understanding. He could only continue to obey orders that he believed to be militarily unsound, while privately despairing at the situation they had created. This psychological burden, added to the physical stress of commanding an army in combat, took its toll on Rommel. His health, never fully restored during his recuperation in Germany, began to deteriorate again. The weight of command under impossible circumstances, the knowledge that the battle was being lost, even as he was ordered to claim it was being won, consumed his energy and his hope. The fundamental tragedy of Rommel's return to command at El Alamein was that it came too late to change the course of the battle and too early to end it. Had Rommel arrived earlier, when the British offensive was only beginning, perhaps he might have convinced Hitler to authorize a strategic withdrawal. Had he arrived later, when the outcome was already decided, he might have managed the retreat with less loss of life. Instead, he arrived at precisely the moment when the battle had reached its critical phase, when the outcome was still undecided, but the momentum had already shifted irreversibly toward the British. He would spend the next days and weeks attempting to salvage what he could from a situation that was deteriorating faster than even he had anticipated. constrained at every step by orders from Berlin that demanded the impossible. The return of the Desert Fox, once a source of hope for German soldiers in North Africa, had become instead a symbol of the tragic contradiction between military necessity and political will that would characterize German warfare from this point forward. While British artillery thundered across the El Alamein line and infantry regiments fought through mine-laden darkness, a quieter but equally devastating struggle unfolded across the Mediterranean Sea. The battle that was being decided in the desert was, in many ways, already being lost in the waters that lay between North Africa and Europe. Axis forces had become entirely dependent on a fragile supply chain that stretched across roughly 900 kilometers of hostile sea, and that chain was now on the verge of complete collapse. The German High Command in North Africa understood with grim clarity that ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements were not mere abstractions. They were the difference between holding the line and retreat, between survival and annihilation. Every shell fired, every kilometer traveled by a tank, every hour an engine ran, consumed irreplaceable resources that could not be easily replaced. The logistics officer became, in this phase of the battle, as important as the general commanding armor divisions, though few soldiers understood how thoroughly supply had become the primary battlefield. The Mediterranean supply route presented Axis planners with an almost insurmountable problem. Germany and Italy depended almost entirely on sea transport to move fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and fresh troops across the Mediterranean to North Africa, a journey that took anywhere from 3 to 7 days depending on the route selected and the vessel's speed. The British, meanwhile, controlled strategic positions at both ends of this narrow sea. They held Egypt, they held bases in Palestine and Cyprus, and they held Malta, that tiny island fortress that sat squarely across the central Mediterranean like a cork in a bottle. From these positions, British submarines, destroyers, and aircraft could strike at Axis convoys almost at will. The simple geography of the Mediterranean made the Axis situation untenable once the British committed themselves to disrupting supply traffic. What had been marginally survivable during months of static desert warfare became catastrophic when the British launched an offensive that demanded massive consumption of fuel and ammunition every single day. By the time Montgomery's artillery barrage opened on the 23rd of October, the Axis supply situation had already begun deteriorating. The British Mediterranean Fleet and RAF Coastal Command had intensified operations throughout September and early October, sinking merchant vessels and damaging warships with increasing frequency. Axis intelligence knew that a major British offensive was coming. Rommel's staff had warned Berlin repeatedly that current supply levels would be utterly insufficient to sustain prolonged heavy fighting. The warnings were acknowledged but not acted upon. Hitler's strategic thinking rarely accommodated logistical constraints, and Berlin remained convinced that Germany's industrial capacity, though strained, could sustain North Africa indefinitely. This fundamental disconnect between strategic ambition and logistical reality would prove catastrophic. The moment the Battle of El Alamein began in earnest, the shortage of supplies transformed from a chronic problem into an acute crisis that would influence every German and Italian tactical decision. Fuel became the most critical shortage. Tanks, trucks, and aircraft cannot move without fuel, and the desert environment demanded extraordinary quantities of it. Vehicles traveling across soft sand consumed fuel at rates roughly 50% higher than operations on roads in Europe. The Axis forces at El Alamein required roughly 200 tons of fuel daily, merely to maintain static defensive operations. During an offensive, consumption could triple or quadruple. The British naval blockade and air attacks on supply convoys meant that actual fuel deliveries to North Africa fell far short of requirements. German tank commanders received increasingly stringent orders to conserve fuel, restricting movement and limiting reconnaissance operations. By the 26th of October, less than 3 days into the battle, German staff officers were calculating fuel reserves with desperate precision, recognizing that certain victory or certain defeat would be determined by whether adequate supplies could be delivered. Vehicles were immobilized, not because they were damaged, but because fuel reserves were so depleted that commanders could not risk their movement. The famous German ability to conduct rapid mobile warfare, the doctrine of blitzkrieg that had terrorized Europe, became impossible in the desert when fuel stocks dwindled to a few days' supply. Ammunition shortages presented an equally severe problem. The constant British artillery bombardment that opened the battle consumed millions of rounds. British gunners had established unprecedented ammunition stocks before the battle began, but the Germans and Italians had not. The opening barrage alone, 900 guns firing simultaneously for 5.5 hours, convinced German commanders that the British had virtually unlimited ammunition supplies. German and Italian artillery was forced to ration their response. Field commanders, who wanted to return fire, were often denied permission because ammunition supplies simply could not support intensive bombardments. Infantry ammunition, particularly for small arms and machine guns, became rationed in some units. The Axis defenders could not match the weight of fire that the British and Commonwealth forces brought against their positions. This ammunition shortage was not merely a tactical inconvenience. It was a strategic constraint that forced German commanders to make decisions based on preserving ammunition rather than tactical necessity. The Axis forces found themselves fighting a war of shortage against an enemy fighting a war of plenty. The British and Mediterranean fleet exploited these constraints with ruthless efficiency. Submarines, operating from bases in Malta and Egypt, positioned themselves along known convoy routes and attacked with increasing effectiveness. The submarine Urge sank the Italian cargo ship Proserpina in late October, destroying supplies urgently needed at the front. Surface vessels conducted night raids. Destroyers and light cruisers would dash across the Mediterranean under cover of darkness, attack supply convoys, and withdraw before German air power could respond effectively. The RAF Coastal Command and RAF Middle East conducted continuous operations against maritime targets. Reconnaissance aircraft identified supply convoys, and bombers followed to attack them. British fighters provided protection for these aircraft, and the Germans, themselves fuel-starved and increasingly short of pilots and replacement aircraft, could not mount sufficient air defense. The result was a steady attrition of merchant vessels and warships attempting to supply North Africa. Between October and November, Axis losses mounted until the supply route became so dangerous that vessels could only be sent at night and in small groups, further reducing overall cargo capacity. Italian vessels bore much of the supply burden, and Italian losses were particularly severe. The Italian Navy, never as well equipped or well trained as the German Navy, suffered disproportionate casualties in efforts to protect convoys. Italian merchant ships, converted for military transport, were sunk with alarming regularity. The Italian government in Rome was already wavering in its commitment to the Axis war effort by autumn of 1942, and these mounting naval losses contributed to the growing sense that North Africa was becoming an unwinnable drain on Italian resources. German commanders knew that they could not rely on Italian shipping to maintain supply lines indefinitely. This knowledge created friction within the Axis command structure. German generals understood that Italy could not or would not maintain the supply effort necessary for victory, yet Hitler's strategy demanded that North Africa be held at all costs. The fundamental incompatibility between strategic ambition and available resources was becoming catastrophically obvious. Reinforcements became an impossibility as the supply crisis deepened. A fresh German division, or even a regiment of replacement troops, required significant shipping space and protection during transit. As British naval and air power made these transits increasingly dangerous, reinforcements simply stopped coming. The divisions fighting at El Alamein on the 25th and 26th of October knew that they would not be reinforced. There would be no fresh tanks to replace those lost in combat, no replacement troops to fill the gaps in decimated companies, no additional heavy weapons to strengthen defensive positions. The German and Italian armies were fighting a war of attrition while systematically losing the ability to replace casualties. This mathematical equation presented only one possible conclusion. Continued fighting would lead to progressive weakening until defeat became inevitable. German commanders with even limited strategic vision understood that they faced a race against time. Either breakthrough must come quickly, or retreat must begin before supplies became so depleted that orderly withdrawal became impossible. The British, by contrast, exercised absolute command of their supply situation. Reinforcements were pouring into Egypt throughout the battle. New tank regiments, fresh artillery units, replacement infantry divisions. These arrived by secure routes through the Suez Canal and were organized in massive supply depots near the combat zone. British supplies had been carefully stockpiled before the offensive began. Ammunition dumps extended for kilometers, fuel reserves were enormous, and replacement vehicles and equipment were abundant. Montgomery's meticulous planning had included logistical planning of equal precision. British commanders never faced the desperate calculation of whether to engage in battle or conserve supplies. Resources were simply available in quantities sufficient to sustain operations indefinitely. This contrast between Axis shortage and British plenty was not accidental. It reflected British strategic superiority in naval power, air power, and industrial capacity. The British were fighting a battle where they possessed every advantage except the German soldiers' tactical skill and courage. By the 28th of October, when Montgomery launched Operation Supercharge, Axis supply stocks had declined to genuinely catastrophic levels. German fuel reserves would sustain operations for perhaps another 5 or 6 days at reduced consumption rates. Ammunition supplies had dropped to levels that permitted only carefully rationed defensive fire. Food stocks were declining. The German High Command authorized Rommel to consider withdrawal if the supply situation became untenable, but Hitler's orders demanded that the line be held. This contradiction between strategic impossibility and political demand created paralysis in the German command structure. Rommel, brilliant at mobile warfare, but constrained by both fuel shortages and Hitler's orders, found himself unable to either defend effectively or attack decisively. The supply crisis did not manifest as a single dramatic moment. Instead, it was a slow, grinding erosion of capability that manifested in every decision, every order, every movement across the battlefield. The pursuit that followed the Battle of El Alamein would not have been possible had Axis supply lines been adequate. British armour, advancing in the final days of the battle and during the subsequent pursuit across the desert toward Libya, moved through terrain where abandoned German and Italian vehicles accumulated in growing numbers. These vehicles were abandoned not because they had been destroyed in combat, but because they had run out of fuel and their crews had to continue on foot or in commandeered vehicles. The photographs taken during the pursuit, show vast fields of trucks, tanks, and cars standing intact but useless, monuments to the supply crisis that had gripped the Axis forces. Some vehicles were destroyed by their crews to prevent capture. Others were simply left when fuel ran out. British soldiers following the retreating Axis armies could mark their progress by counting the vehicle graveyards left behind. The logistical collapse that occurred during and after the Battle of El Alamein represented a fundamental shift in the nature of North African warfare. The era of rapid mobile operations, where Rommel had maneuvered with audacious speed and achieved victories despite inferior numbers, was ending. The new era would be one of material superiority, industrial output, and logistical dominance. The British had learned, through painful years of desert campaign experience, that desert warfare could not be won through tactical brilliance alone when the enemy possessed superior industrial capacity and control of the Mediterranean. By the time the Battle of El Alamein began, the British had positioned themselves to win through the simple expedient of possessing more of everything: more troops, more tanks, more guns, more ammunition, more fuel, and more supplies. Rommel, the master of maneuver, found himself defeated not by clever tactics, but by the inexorable weight of logistics. The victory at El Alamein belonged not only to the soldiers who fought in the desert, but to the sailors who protected convoys, the submarine crews who sank enemy shipping, the RAF pilots who attacked supply convoys, and the British logisticians who ensured that their own forces never faced the nightmarish shortage that was strangling the Axis armies. The Battle of El Alamein would be remembered as a military victory, but it was fundamentally a victory of supply over scarcity, of industrial capacity over limited resources, of strategic patience over tactical audacity. 5 days into the battle, the grinding attrition that characterized the early stages of El Alamein had begun to exhaust both armies in different ways. The British, with their steady supply of fresh reserves and ammunition arriving daily, could sustain losses and continue applying pressure. The Axis forces, by contrast, faced a mounting crisis. Their fuel reserves dwindled with each passing hour. Their casualty lists grew longer, while replacement troops could not reach the front, and their defensive positions, though still formidable, were now held by exhausted men operating on rationed ammunition and the increasingly hollow knowledge that reinforcements would not come. Montgomery understood this calculus with perfect clarity. He had studied the intelligence reports detailing Axis supply shortages, and he had watched the interdiction of their Mediterranean convoys with satisfaction. The question was not whether the British would eventually break through, but whether they could do so decisively enough to transform a hard-won tactical victory into a strategically decisive pursuit. By the afternoon of the 28th of October, Montgomery had concluded that 5 days of methodical advance through the minefield zone and prepared defences had accomplished their purpose. The outer Axis defensive positions had been breached. British armour had penetrated into deeper positions, and the defending forces had been forced to commit reserves that could not be replaced. What remained was not another day of gradual attrition, but rather a concentrated assault designed to shatter the remaining Axis cohesion and create the space for mobile warfare across open ground. This was the concept behind Operation Supercharge, a plan that concentrated fresh infantry divisions and armoured brigades at a single point in the narrow frontage between the Mediterranean coast and the Qattara Depression. The operation represented a calculated gamble. Commit enough force at a specific location to overwhelm local Axis defences and achieve a breakthrough, rather than continuing to press along the entire front with diminishing returns on each kilometre gained. Montgomery believed his reserves were sufficient, his artillery was overwhelming, and Axis reserves were exhausted. The time had come to test that judgment. The assault began during the evening of the 28th of October as darkness fell across the desert. British infantry regiments, many newly arrived from Egypt and at full strength, advanced into positions from which they would mount the assault. Behind them, concentrated in an area barely 5 kilometers wide, British and Commonwealth armor waited in dispersed formations that minimized their exposure to German anti-tank fire, while keeping them ready for rapid advance once the infantry assault succeeded. The artillery preparation for Operation Supercharge was methodical and devastating. British guns concentrated on the narrow section of Axis defensive line where the breakthrough was intended, creating a zone of destruction that would isolate the defenders and prevent reinforcement from adjacent sectors. The barrage continued for approximately 2 hours, a rolling bombardment that was less spectacular than the initial opening bombardment of the entire offensive, but in some ways more precisely calibrated to the tactical objective. German and Italian defenders in the target zone huddled in their trenches and weapon pits, enduring the detonations that collapsed fortifications and buried supplies and communications equipment. When the infantry assault went forward at 0600 hours on the 29th of October, the attacking troops discovered that the Axis defences in their sector had been thoroughly disrupted. The minefield, while still present, had been partially cleared or marked by previous assault waves, and the defending positions were now occupied by demoralized troops with exhausted supplies and no clear sense of how long they could hold. The attacking British and Commonwealth regiments advanced rapidly in the early darkness before dawn, encountering resistance but not the determined counter-assaults that had characterized earlier phases of the battle. German and Italian units fought back, surely, because the orders to hold had come from the highest levels of command, but the fighting lacked the organized ferocity of the first days. Men pulled back from untenable positions, not waiting for orders. Anti-tank guns were abandoned when fuel ran out for their tractors. Communication between units broke down because telephone lines had been severed by the bombardment, and radio discipline had deteriorated under stress. By the time full dawn arrived on the 29th of October, the British infantry had penetrated several kilometers into the Axis defensive zone. Losses had been significant. Casualty lists would eventually tally more than 2,000 men, but the penetration was decisive. The question that had haunted Montgomery through 5 days of grinding warfare now seemed to be answered. The Axis line had broken. What remained was the exploitation of that breakthrough by the concentrated armour that waited behind the infantry. British and Commonwealth tank regiments began moving forward through the gaps torn in the defensive line, their crews understanding that they had been given a rare opportunity. If the armour could accelerate westward before Axis reserves could reorganize or establish a new defensive position, the entire Axis army could be cut off and destroyed. This was the moment toward which all 5 days of attritional warfare had been leading, the transition from grinding positional battle to the mobile warfare in which British armour could operate effectively. Rommel, who had returned to command only 4 days earlier, watched the situation deteriorate with the grim recognition of a commander whose strategic options had been constrained into impossibility. He had immediately grasped upon his return that the Axis position was unsustainable. The fuel shortage was catastrophic. Some account records indicate that German forces had fuel sufficient for only a few more days of mobile operations, and ammunition supplies were similarly critical. Rommel had requested permission to conduct a fighting withdrawal westward, to establish a new defensive position at a location where supply lines would be shorter and resupply more feasible. But Hitler's response had been unambiguous. There would be no withdrawal. The line would be held. The battle would be fought to the last man if necessary. This was the same strategic paralysis that had afflicted German command at other critical moments during the war, the substitution of political will for military logic. The armor exploitation that Montgomery had planned unfolded over the remainder of the 29th and through the 30th of October, with a speed that surprised even the planners. Tank regiments, advancing in loose formations that minimized their vulnerability to artillery fire while maintaining mutual support, pushed westward beyond the prepared Axis defensive zone. The German panzer units that had been held in reserve to mount a decisive counterattack found themselves unable to do so. Fuel shortages meant that the concentrated tank battles at which Rommel excelled could not be fought. Vehicles had to be rationed for essential movement. Long-range maneuvers were impossible, and the British air superiority meant that any concentration of armor would draw immediate air attack. The German tankers, accustomed to the fluid maneuver warfare of the desert campaigns, found themselves pinned and immobilized, watching British armor advance while they lacked the fuel to mount even a tactical response. The mechanics of military collapse are often obscure from the perspective of soldiers in the ranks. Orders continue to flow down chains of command. Units continue to occupy assigned positions. Senior commanders continue to issue instructions as though coherent strategy still exists. But the reality, the invisible fact that only those with access to the complete intelligence picture fully comprehend, is that the army has already ceased to function as a coordinated instrument. By the 30th of October, this invisible collapse was becoming visible. Axis units were receiving contradictory orders: hold this position, withdraw to the next position, stand firm, because the command structure was attempting to respond to a situation that was no longer susceptible to tactical correction. Individual commanders, faced with British armor advancing toward their positions, and no fuel or ammunition to mount effective resistance, began making the decision to withdraw or surrender rather than wait for orders. The army as a unified entity, though still nominally commanded by Rommel and still containing men willing to fight, was fragmenting into isolated units and individuals attempting to survive an increasingly impossible situation. The British, operating with clear objectives and adequate supplies, pressed their advantage with methodical efficiency. Montgomery's command structure remained intact and responsive. Supply lines, though stretched, continued to deliver ammunition and fuel, and reserve units were available to exploit breakthroughs and push the pursuit forward. The contrast between the two armies during the exploitation phase was profound and visible in every metric. British tanks could maneuver freely because fuel was available. German tanks could not maneuver because fuel had run out. British artillery could fire in support of advancing units because ammunition continued to arrive. German artillery became increasingly silent as ammunition supplies dwindled. British infantry could advance because they carried rations and ammunition. German and Italian defenders found themselves increasingly immobilized by shortages of basic supplies. By the 31st of October, Operation Supercharge had achieved its intended objective decisively. The Axis defensive line had been broken. The opportunity for organized counterattack had passed. The transition from positional warfare to pursuit warfare had been accomplished. The human cost of this transition had been substantial on both sides, but the strategic significance was unmistakable. The battle that would consume more than another week of fighting as the Axis forces were pursued westward had been, in its essential character, decided during Operation Supercharge. The Eighth Army would continue to advance and continue to suffer casualties, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Rommel, recognizing that continued adherence to Hitler's order to stand firm would result in the encirclement and capture of the entire Axis force, made the decision to initiate a general withdrawal. This decision, taken against explicit orders from Berlin, represented a commander's judgment that military reality must supersede political directive. The consequences of this choice would include Hitler's lasting distrust of Rommel, but the alternative was the destruction of an army. Operation Supercharge represented something more than simply one battle within the larger engagement at El Alamein. It embodied the fundamental transformation in the strategic balance in North Africa. For more than 2 years, the Axis forces, particularly the Afrika Korps under Rommel, had maintained the initiative in the desert theatre through superior tactics, aggressive leadership, and the ability to maneuver and concentrate force at decisive points.